It is.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Joseph Gildenhorn, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. It's my real pleasure to welcome you to today's conference entitled Options for U.S. Policy Towards the Israeli-Arab Conflict. The Wilson Center was established by an act of Congress in 1968 as the nation's official living memorial to Woodrow Wilson. And it should be noted that the center is currently celebrating the 150th anniversary of his birth. As both a distinguished scholar and a national leader, Woodrow Wilson felt strongly that the scholar and the policymaker were engaged in a common enterprise. Aiming to bridge the gap between the worlds of ideas and the world of policy, the Wilson Center was created as a nonpartisan institute for advanced study and a neutral forum for open, serious, and informed dialogue. Today's program is part of a series arranged by the Middle East Program Director Hala Esfandiari and her able staff to bring together Israeli, Palestinian, and other regional authorities, along with experts from the United States. And they will discuss the role of the U.S. and its potential engagement in the Middle East, a very sensitive and challenging area of the world. My wife Alma and I were pleased to establish the Joseph and Alma Gildenhorn Middle East Forum in 2004, which was created to explore opportunities and the means to resolve regional conflicts, including but not limited to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The forum continues to address the role of individuals, governments, NGOs in advocating and promoting peace and stability in the region. The last time that we met at the center to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was in May of this year. The meeting took place after the political victories of Hamas in the Palestinian territories and the Kadima Party in Israel. The panelists at that time examined the impact of the changing Palestinian and Israeli political environment and the next possible steps for hopeful resolution of the continuing conflict. Since that conference in May, the Palestinian government in Gaza, led by Hamas and the party of President Mahmoud Abbas, continue to disagree on Palestinian policy towards Israel. Even while rumors of a national unity government continues to spread in that area, Hamas and Israel remain locked in conflict. And as we all know, Israel and Hezbollah fought a devastating war in Lebanon this past summer. I believe that we can all agree that the U.S. role will be central to any resolution of the many issues that divide Israel and the Palestinians, as well as the problems and issues that led to the open hostilities between Israel and Hezbollah. Our meeting today, which comes in the wake of Prime Minister Olmert's visit, will address the possible role of the United States, as seen not only from the perspective of Washington, but also from the perspective of the major regional players in the area. Our first panel, moderated by Aaron Miller, will examine U.S. options for engagement in the ongoing, although currently dormant, Israel-Palestinian peace process. And the second panel, moderated by Dennis Ross, will examine America's options and positions with respect to the involvement and future roles of both Lebanon and Syria in the overall and most complex picture. There will also be discussions of the Syrian role as seen from the Israeli perspective. You all have copies of the bios of the distinguished speakers, panelists, and moderators, so please refer to your program. Again, thank you for coming, and we look forward to a most interesting and provocative discussion of these important issues. Thank you very much. Hala?
Good morning. I'm Hala Esfandiari. I would like to add my voice to that of Ambassador Gildenhorn to welcome you on behalf of the Middle East Program. The Middle East Program is among the youngest programs at the Wilson Center, and it was launched in 1998. The program concentrates on long-term developments and their impact on political and social structure, economic development, and the relations between the region and the United States. This is our fourth meeting in the Joseph and Alma Gildenhorn Middle East Forum. I really would like to extend my thanks to my colleague and friend Aaron David Miller, who is a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center, had it not been for him and his connection to all the speakers, I don't think I would have been able to invite such a distinguished panel to our program. So thanks again, Aaron, who spent hours on the phone trying to track you all over the world. I would also like to remind you, if possible, to close your cell phones because it's a bit disruptive when suddenly a phone starts ringing. We started a little bit earlier, and the reason is that we have 5 speakers on the first panel, and we thought we'll give them a bit more time. Once this room is filled up, we will have an overflow on the 5th floor, and we will take questions in writing from them. Aaron?
Hala, thank you very much. I want to express my appreciation, Joe, for your commitment and generosity, you and Alma, to the center, and particularly to this symposium. We gather this morning, I think it's fair to say, at a very critical time for Israelis and Palestinians and for Americans. Rarely, if ever, have I seen a situation more uncertain, more confused, and more fraught with risk for Israelis, Palestinians, and for Americans. And as usual this morning, it seems we gather every time we discuss these issues of late, we gather with many more questions than answers. Is unilateralism, an approach applied by the government of Israel over the last several years, dead? And if in fact it is, and trying to create an environment for serious bilateral negotiations is extremely problematic right now, how do we move ahead? Is it possible to create a Palestinian national unity government, which is both credible and functional, to deal with economic and security needs, let alone to deal with the complicated problems of negotiating with Israel? What about Hamas? What do we do with this organization and this popular movement? Should it be included in the process? Can it be confronted or marginalized? It took us more than 20 years to bring the secular manifestation of Palestinian nationalism, the Palestine Liberation Organization, into a diplomatic process with the Israelis. How long will it take to bring the religious manifestation of Palestinian nationalism into the same process? Israeli internal politics. How credible, effective, and functional can Ehud Olmert be, given domestic political realities in Israel and the very real sense that he's been weakened in the wake of the Lebanon war? Is there any national consensus in Israel or on the Palestinian side to create a basis for a negotiation for permanent status, discussions, and ultimately for an agreement? And finally, what about the role of the United States over the next 2 years? Will Iraq and the modifications in our policy, which will probably be forthcoming, suck all of the political oxygen and space in this town and reserve it specifically for Iraq? Or is there room and political capital to be spent on serious Arab-Israeli peacemaking in the next 2 years? And is there a connection between Iraq and the pursuit of Arab-Israeli peace with respect to American policy? To help us answer all of these questions and many more, we have a distinguished panel. Each of them brings a richness and a different perspective to the discussion, and I'm absolutely certain that it will be a lively one. You have all of their bios in front of you. Let me just say about each of them in the order that they will speak. Yasser Abed-Rabbo is a member of the PLO's executive committee and a longtime observer, participant, negotiator, and advisor in Palestinian politics. He's been around this problem for a very long time. He's also a very adept and creative poet.
What?
Matan Vilnai is a member of the Israeli Labor Party and a member of Knesset. He has a long and distinguished career in the Israeli military. He was, in 1999, a Minister of Science, Culture, and Sport. Welcome, Yasser, and welcome, Matan. Amjad Atella is currently president of the Strategic Assessment Initiative, and again, a long-time, very astute observer of Palestinian politics and advisor to both the Office of Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and a member of the Palestinian Negotiation Support Unit for many years. And Gali Golan, very distinguished professor, formerly at the Hebrew University, now at the Interdisciplinary Center in Herzliya, an expert in her own right on Soviet and Russian policy toward the Middle East, and a longtime activist in Israeli Peace Now. The format this morning is very straightforward, and I will ensure that it remains that way. Each panelist will speak for no more than 10 minutes, and I will be watching very carefully. I will then offer a few words, and I do mean a few words as the only American on this panel in a discussion of options for U.S. policy. We will then try to generate for a bit, and the second piece of this, an internal discussion among our panelists, and then I want to leave plenty of time, and I do mean plenty of time, for questions and answers from you. We will conclude, I assure you, by 10:30 in order to take a break and to make room and space for the next panel, which will begin promptly at 10:50. So, with that brief introduction, Yasser, the floor, podium is yours.
Thank you, sir. Yani, as Aaron had given me another title, new one, which is a poet, I'll start with dreams today in the morning. In our region, in fact, sometimes we set traps for ourselves and we then don't find a way. We spend all the time trying to find a way how to get out of these traps. One of these traps are whether there is a Palestinian partner or not. The Israelis, some Israeli leaders, not all of them, of course, spent the last, 5-6 years pretending that they don't want to move forward because there is no Palestinian counterpart. And some American administrations, some American officials are busy today to watch whether there will be a national unity government or not, because this is considered, and I don't know who had made this consideration, that this is the key. If there is no national unity government, then nothing will move ahead. And that the peace process will be stuck. Let us try another way of addressing the situation in the Middle East. Why don't we try to start tomorrow an initiative based on direct negotiations between the two sides? Sometimes this position is faced with the remark that the negotiations between the two sides are very difficult at this moment. I don't know why it is difficult, and I don't know if it is compared with the stalemate, with the stagnation, with the dangers that might arise if this stagnation will continue. I don't know why we cannot go towards direct negotiations between the two sides. I don't know why in the Middle East we are encouraging negotiations. We are every day watching initiatives that we know that they don't have a promising future. Initiatives in Iraq, initiatives concerning Lebanon, initiatives concerning Syria, Israel, etc., and initiatives concerning the thorny issues like Iran and the nuclear weapons. Every day there are news about initiatives that are being considered, with the exception of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. We are not trying what we did not complete in the past, which is direct negotiations between the two sides. Are we afraid of failure? So, failure of these negotiations might be much more better than the continuation of the present conditions, which will lead every day to more deterioration and the danger of some kind of explosion, which every time we predict and every time our prediction proves to be true. We have a platform, we have an agenda, which is the Arab Initiative. We, Palestinians, Israelis, Arabs, Americans, at certain moments we thought that this is good initiative. Sometimes we neglect it, then we go back and remember it when the time and the atmosphere is not right for it. Nowadays, we have a majority of the Arab states who support direct negotiations with Israel and who are ready to participate, whether directly or indirectly, in monitoring and supervising and being involved even directly in the details of these negotiations between Palestinians and Israelis. I know some Israeli leaders who want to see these negotiations come as soon as possible. And I know about the obstacles. Now, the major obstacle which is being discussed nowadays is the issue of the Palestinian government. Will there be a national unity government or not? I'm not so optimistic about it. And I don't want everything to be tied to this matter. If we have a government, then we have a breakthrough. If we don't have a government, then we are being blamed for the kind of dead end or stagnation or whatever it is. I think if we do that, we are strengthening the role of Hamas, because in this case, Hamas will hold the key of peace and war in its hand. And I don't believe that this is the intention of all parties concerned. There is a partner, and it could be tried with the direct relations talks with the president of the Palestinian Authority, with the PLO leadership, which is still recognized even by Hamas as the official political leadership of the Palestinian people. I don't know if this American administration is ready to take such a step, to encourage both sides to sit and talk and try once again to revive the idea of a final status solution. So many people are skeptical about the will, the intentions, and the readiness of this administration to do that. We are now being stuck with so many maybe important issues, but so many secondary issues, I would call them. We are stuck with the negotiations about one Israeli soldier and few hundred Palestinian prisoners to be exchanged. And so many countries in the Middle East are spending days and days, delegations coming and going to discuss how we can make that deal. We are stuck with other issues, waiting for the successful outcome of negotiations between Hamas, Fatah about the national unity government. I think we can go on a parallel track. We can move on a parallel track, which is, let's go and attack once again the issue, the major issue of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And let's go and use the old recipe, which is direct negotiations between the two sides. Failure is not inevitable, but a disaster is inevitable if we don't start such a process. And on the other hand, we can continue solving all other problems, starting with the crossings of Gaza, Carney agreement, which was arranged by the American administration 3-4 times, and each time it fails because they repeat focusing on it without going to the core issues and the major problems. And the one last sentence I would like to say about the Palestinian National Unity Government. We cannot escape from that. I think it's a complicated thing, and I'm not so, as I said, I'm not so optimistic about it. The gap is wide. Hamas still connects between its own political agenda and platform as a party and the political agenda which is needed for a Palestinian government that can address the whole world, that can deal with Israel. They want a recognition of their agenda, and we know that this is a very complicated political process. There are, of course, some pragmatic elements inside Hamas who are thinking now how to separate between their own political program and agenda and leave it aside and use it wherever they want to use it with their constituency, in their campaigns, etc., but not to use it as a part of the political program of the future Palestinian movement. We are trying to deal with these pragmatic elements, people who, if they have readiness to do that. On the other hand, I believe even if we will succeed in forming such a government, I don't know how such a government with an unclear political program, or each side will interpret the political program his way, I don't know how it will be able to work and function in the future. It might be a kind of a crippled government in this case. So it's not a question of only forming the government. It's a question, maybe we will be able to do that. I don't know. If it's a question of what will this government do the day after its formation, and the prospects are not so encouraging. So the main conclusion which we reached at, even with Hamas leadership and with other, whether pragmatic or semi-pragmatic elements inside Hamas and other factions, any government that will come in the future should deal with the domestic issues and domestic files, and leave the political file to the President of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO leadership, the same leadership and the same address that made in the past all the agreements and signed these agreements with Israel. We will try in a way or another to isolate the internal Palestinian crisis away from the peace process and negotiations. I know it's a very difficult thing, but this is the only option for the short run, at least. If this is accepted and this is understood, in this way we don't leave this card in the hands of those whom we don't want them to use it against the peace process. Thank you very much.
Matan.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here to discuss the situation between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and what Yasser and me agreed 2 minutes before we start, that both of us are very pessimists, and there is nothing optimism we can say about the struggle in these days. And the problem is that the other way it will be war, and everyone understands the difference between living in war and living trying to achieve peace, although it's very complicated. The main problem first of all, let's put it this way. All the sides, Palestinians and Israelis as well, understand that the only solution will be a two-state solution. A Palestinian state alongside Israel. It's not easy to say it because 10 years ago, to mention in Israel a Palestinian state, it was a deep mistake for a politician or to a leader. But in these days, after 10 years, after the Oslo process and all this, we understand, and they understand, that the only solution will be a two-state solution. The problem is that we can't achieve that now, and there are several problems. Maybe the most important one is the weakness of the leaders, the weakness of Abu Abbas, the weakness of our Prime Minister, Ehud Olmert, and the weakness of the President of the United States, President George Bush. And this is the main issue now. Each one of them, because of his own problems, sometimes is connected to the conflict, sometimes not, but basically they are not strong enough within their states to achieve something. And this is number one. The second one, and maybe the most important one, and you try to say it's not so important, the Islamization of the conflict. The Islamization of the conflict, it's not like it started in Oslo in September 93. It's not the same. Then it was a conflict between two communities, the Israelis, the Palestinians. You can deal with it. Now, it's not anymore Palestinians and Israelis. Now, it's Islam and Israelis. The Islamization of the conflict, presented by the government of Hamas, that their agenda is very simple. There is no Israel. This is their agenda. And their agenda is that Israel must not remain in the Middle East, that Israel must not remain at all. So it's not easy to deal with one that at the first hand he said, you are not there. What would you like to talk about? And this is the main issue, not only between Israelis and Palestinians, but within the Palestinian society as well. And looking to the Palestinian society as Fatah or PLO and Hamas, it's not the right way to do it now. Because each one of them divided within his organization, the PLO and the Hamas, between the government and the authorities in Judea and Samaria and Gaza, and the people abroad, in Damascus, in Hamas case, in Tunisia, in PLO case. So it's not easy at all. The chaos within the Palestinian Authority, the lack of leadership within the Palestinian Authority, the Islamization of the whole conflict, of the whole process, is the main issue. And when we are saying there is no one to deal with, we know why we are saying it. Because we would like to find one, and President Abbas is the right one, I agree about it, to deal with. But the problem is strong enough to deal with us and to submit a very crucial problems in order to try to solve them. And what must be done? And this is the main issue. I agree again that the initiative of Beirut Initiative, how you call it, the Arab League Initiative?
The Arab Summit Initiative.
The Arab Summit Initiative, maybe this is now the right way to start it in order to do something. And I am sure that if the United States of America, with the Egyptians, with the Jordanians, and with the Saudis, we work together about it, it will be the first step to find a solution. And it must be done now. Because speaking about the Middle East, speaking about the American involvements in Iraq, speaking about the Iranian new capability, the Iranian trying to acquire a nuclear capability. To deal with all this, you have to start with the Palestinians and Israelis. There is no other way. You have to start with the peace process in the Middle East, not only the Israeli Palestinians, the Israelis and the whole Arab world. And I am sure, I'm not sure, I believe, I guess, that any recommendation, if it would be from Secretary Baker or someone else, and then we'll start with the negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians in order to solve the problems of the Middle East, and it's not only the Middle East now, because of the Iranian capability, it's not only the Middle East, it's the whole globe. Thank you.
Matan, thank you. Amjad?
Thanks, Aaron. I want to thank the Woodrow Wilson Center for having me, and I'm especially appreciative to be on a panel with so many of my colleagues and some of my good friends. A few years ago, I was visiting the home of a friend, and they had a little child, 3 or 4 years old, and I was playing ball with him. He had a plastic bat and a plastic ball, and I'd throw the plastic ball, and he'd try to hit it with a bat. At one point, he just walked up to me, and then, without warning, with the bat, he just struck me across the face. Broke my glasses, knocked them off my face. And I yelled, and I was like, ow, and I covered my face. And the mother ran into the room, and she saw me there with my hand on my face and my glasses on the floor, and him standing with the bat over me. She said, what happened? And he looked at me, and with all innocence, he said, yeah, Amjad, what happened? And I thought, oh, it's amazing. He hasn't connected cause and effect. And I'm reminded of that story every time an American diplomat asks me, why is it that Palestinians are responding the way they're responding to American policy? There seems to be a disconnect between a recognition of what the United States proposes and what the United States does on the ground and what the logical response, even if it's not a desired response, is to that. And usually when we have these forums, we discuss what the Palestinian problems are, what the Palestinians have missed. Sometimes we'll discuss what the Israelis have missed. But rarely do we actually do an analysis of what has the United States missed. And so I thought I would just concentrate on that today. Basically, the United States has stopped attempting to pursue a negotiated two-state solution in February of 2001. And I'm going to go through a quick chronology of how the United States has done that. In April of 2001, the Mitchell report came out, and it was a carefully written report. It addressed the role of settlements in the current violence. It addressed the necessity of negotiations. And it even gave a working definition of terrorism. As far as I know, the only working definition of terrorism that's actually been provided in the United States. It was ignored. It was just simply put on a shelf, and the United States government walked away from it. In March of 2002, the Arab League Summit, as Mr. Abed-Rabbo pointed out, 22 Arab states, including at the time Saddam Hussein's Iraq and Gaddafi's Libya, all agreed that they would normalize relations with Israel once Israel concluded peace agreements and ended its occupation of Arab territory. That was ignored. June 2002, the PLO submits for the first time ever its own peace plan to the United States, a 3-track peace plan. In some ways, it presaged the roadmap. It had 3 lines: security, reform, and final status negotiations that would take place concurrently in parallel and would be mutually reinforcing and complementary to each other. The United States was very polite, listened very nicely, and then gave the June 24 speech in which it endorsed a 2-state solution, but with the same breath called for the replacement of the Palestinian government. In December of 2002, the roadmap, which was already drafted by then, was postponed at the behest of Israel until April of 2003. In order to keep the Europeans busy during that time, the United States engaged in negotiations with the Europeans on a monitoring and verification plan that would be an addendum or an annex to the roadmap, so that there would be an objective analysis of who's doing what on the ground during the roadmap period. At the end of April 2003, just before the roadmap was to be presented, Dov Weisglass visited Dr. Rice, and she summarily removed the annex, informed the Palestinians, informed the Israelis, and left it to us to inform the quartet. December 1st, 2003, the Palestinians and the Israelis, and when I say the Palestinian, many members of the Palestinian negotiating team, the official negotiating team, negotiated in an unofficial track with the members of the Israeli previous negotiating team and concluded an agreement called the Geneva Initiative, which was effectively an extension of what Taba would have looked like had it continued for 2 months. Again, and Mr. Abed Rabbo was part of that. Again, that was ignored. Even though Secretary of State Powell was willing to meet with the Geneva Initiative authors, it was a diplomatic meeting, a polite meeting, but there was nothing in the U.S. policy to endorse it. November 2004, Yasser Arafat dies, and Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, becomes president in January of 2005 in an election that was universally seen as fair, in which he wins over 65% of the vote. Again, no attempt to engage his administration in negotiations whatsoever. As a matter of fact, there's tacit support for a unilateral separation plan that Ariel Sharon puts forward, and instead of negotiations even after Arafat's death, instead of negotiations on coordination, not even on permanent status issues, but just on coordination of this unilateral separation, the United States does not in any way or form support that. September 2005, you actually have the redeployment, the unilateral redeployment by Israeli troops to the borders of the Gaza Strip. But you have no freedom of movement, you have no trade agreement, you have no implementation even of the agreements that Jim Wolfenson was able to negotiate between the parties. January 2006, Hamas is elected on a platform of good governance explicitly and implicitly on the unilateral separation plan. Hamas's policy was the same as Olmert's. It accepted the concept of unilateral separation and preferred it to that of permanent status negotiations. The United States' response to that, and Hamas even had a fallback position or a safety net position in which it said, and if you really don't want to do that, and if you really do think you want to have permanent status negotiations, and they could say this because they were convinced the Israelis didn't, they said you could negotiate with President Abbas, negotiate with the PLO. We recognize them as the national movement. They can negotiate with you, and if they agree to anything, we'll put it to a referendum. If the public accepts it, we will endorse it, even if we don't we'll implement it, even if we don't endorse it. And they put that in writing. The United States policy, however, was to take the Nicaragua tactic circa 1980s. Concept was that the Palestinian government now needed to be overthrown, and the United States would do whatever it needed to do, including a sanctions regime or a starvation policy, as some people in the administration called it, in order to convince the Palestinian public that the price to pay for their elected representatives was too high and they should support a change in government, even if there were no constitutional mechanisms to have that change in government. Now, November 2006, the Palestinian government run by Hamas, the PLO, and the Arab League all endorse a peace conference between all of the Arab states, including the Palestinian government and Israel. And Hamas explicitly, actually Mahmoud Zahar explicitly stands up on stage and says, and we accept that. And of course there's a deafening silence, again, from the United States. Again, and the concentration is once again on, well, have they gone far enough? Have the Palestinians done enough? The real question is, if the United States does not want permanent status negotiations, then there's really no room for Fatah. If Fatah refuses to reform itself as a political party, Fatah's only raison d'etre remaining is to negotiate a peace agreement with the State of Israel. And if it cannot accomplish that, and it cannot provide good governance, and it cannot provide representative government, and it cannot provide corruption-free government, then it doesn't have a reason to exist in the Palestinian political system. At the same time, if the United States does not want Hamas, it cannot have unilateral separation either. The fallback position of unilateral separation implies that there's somebody on the other side of the wall who's going to be able to keep security, who's going to be able to keep the Hudna that Olmert and before him Sharon proposed to the Palestinians. So if there's no permanent status and there's no unilateral separation, then what is U.S. policy? And I think that that's where we hit a brick wall. I don't believe that there is an articulated U.S. policy towards the region right now, towards the Israeli-Palestinian peace process. The United States would like a default unilateral separation plan, but won't propose it or push it outside of an Israeli desire to do so. And the United States does not support or is not prepared to expend the political capital on a permanent status negotiation yet. So the policy then becomes by default conflict. It's very similar to U.S. policy in other parts of the Middle East, which is based on the concept of victory instead of peace. The idea is that you can achieve victory outside of the context of a political settlement. However, we haven't yet proven that that's possible. We haven't proven it's possible in Afghanistan. We haven't proven it's possible in Iraq. And we certainly haven't proven that it's possible in the Israeli and Palestinian contexts. So, more importantly than whether there's a Palestinian unity government, more importantly than whether Olmert develops a strong enough government to come up with a policy, more importantly than whether Avigdor Lieberman's ethnic cleansing policy becomes part and parcel of Israeli government policy, is the question of U.S. policy. Is U.S. policy going to change so that it actually supports a permanent status negotiated settlement between Israelis and Palestinians? And once the United States changes its goals to that, we can then begin to articulate tactics that can get us there. However, outside of that, we're missing, I think, the biggest problem in the room. Thank you.
Amjad, thank you. Galia?
Well, unlike my colleagues here, I'm an optimist. I believe that the Lebanon war, for all its negative aspects, has created some opportunities and possibly opened the way for something of a breakthrough. I would say this for three reasons, or three repercussions or results of the war. One of them is that as a result of the war, and even during the war, the Israeli-Palestinian and the Israeli-Arab conflict was put back on the international agenda. I don't know how long it'll stay there. It's often overshadowed, even now, by other events, but basically it sort of came back into the international focus, talks of an international conference. Arab states, because of their concern over the support that Islamic militants received in the course of the war and as a result of the war, Arab states have put forth once again and are pushing the Arab League Peace Initiative. The regional element or aspect of the war, I think, has a lot to do with this, by putting it back, by bringing to the fore once again the connection between the various conflicts in the Middle East, or at the very least the use that Islamic militants make of the Palestinian issue and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Makes a connection between these things, including, in fact, not just Israel and the Arab world, but of course Iran, Syria, and even Iraq, in terms of the instability of the region. So I think because of this, the interconnectedness of these conflicts and the dangers of instability in the Middle East, once again, focus has turned to the Israeli-Arab and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The second thing that came out of the war, which I won't elaborate, is the Israeli agreement to an international force in southern Lebanon. Basically an unprecedented agreement to withdraw in favor of an international force, an expanded UNIFIL, that would provide and create a buffer and provide a degree of security, or at least stabilization, at least for a period of time. I think it's a precedent, an important one. It's one that might be able to be transferred to the Israeli-Palestinian arena and an Israeli-Palestinian border. The third result, which I think is perhaps the most important of all, perhaps, is the end of unilateralism. That is to say, the government admission or announcement in Israel that unilateralism will not be the policy, that it's no longer relevant. One could say that unilateralism was dead, and certainly I would take the interpretation that it's dead, because we saw with Lebanon that withdrawal without agreement does not bring security for Israel. We withdrew from Lebanon entirely, and this withdrawal, unilaterally conceived, did not result in it did not result in security for Israel. That's one conclusion. I must add, though, that there are others who, and I would say it's more the majority view, that rejected unilateralism and saw the war as a clear sign that unilateralism doesn't work for other reasons, and that it was the interpretation if you unilaterally withdraw, you do not get security, the emphasis being on withdrawal. That withdrawal does not bring security, while we could urge people to understand that withdrawal without agreement is the problem, and the issue is really unilateralism. Be that as it may, the conclusion from the war in the Israeli public was not that use of military force will not bring about resolution of the conflict, however we define the conflict. The conclusion actually was that we lost the war, and that is the general perception in Israel, that we lost this war, and that the reason we lost it was, in fact, misuse of force, or to put it somewhat differently, that the army was not permitted to use all the force it had at its disposal. The government was to blame, poor decision-making, changes in objectives during the war, poor preparation. All this led to the army not being able to do what it hopefully or presumably could do. And I think that, I personally think that this conclusion amongst most of the public is due to a sense of vulnerability. The fact that we did not win this war, I think, has had a traumatic effect on Israelis. I'm not sure we've seen the results of it, but the immediate response has been just the opposite, in a sense of self-denial, saying, in fact, we could have won this war had the army been permitted to do what it should do and knows how to do. I think, as I say, this was a response to vulnerability, and the inclusion of Lieberman in the government, I think, was part of that response to the vulnerability. Lieberman, who is a racist, very, very strong conservative, is perceived as a strong leader. And I think that this is part and parcel of his popularity today, which, of course, soared after the war. I don't think that this is necessarily why Olmert brought him into the government. He was brought into the government in order to strengthen the coalition for domestic reasons, to get the budget passed and so forth, internal political reasons. But I say this because I do not believe that bringing Lieberman into the government was an indication of the policy the government is intending to pursue. With the end of unilateralism, the government and Kadima, the major party in the government, became rudderless. They lost all policy. In fact, Kadima had been built basically originally around Sharon, ultimately around the policy of unilateral withdrawal from certain parts of the West Bank. And the government was formed on this policy. This was basically the only thing that held the government together. And so with the end of unilateralism, we find that the government faces a policy vacuum. In fact, on the eve of Rosh Hashanah, on the New Year, when a newspaper interviewer asked the Prime Minister what the government's agenda would be for the coming year, the answer was that a government's business is to run the country. It doesn't need an agenda. And this was a very clear admission that the government has no policy. I think basically we're in a state of limbo. I'm sure that it's looking for one. I thought possibly we might hear more when Olmert was here in Washington. But at the moment, the government is still without a policy. I think this vacuum could be filled if we were to seize upon the opportunities that I believe were created or have been created by the Lebanon War. The Arab interest, renewed interest, as I said, in the Arab Peace Initiative, and the Arab Peace Initiative, which we might discuss later, has extremely important points in it, including end of conflict and normal peaceful relations with Israel, based on relatively new ideas, or some new ideas that could be constructive from Israel's point of view. The possibility of a national unity government in the Palestinian Authority. I agree with Abd Rabu. I think we could have negotiated and should have negotiated with Abu Mazen all along and still can. But if indeed there is a national unity government, this would provide perhaps a way out of the three conditions that that Israel, the United States, and the Europeans have set upon the Palestine Authority, and might find a way to open the road to negotiations, particularly if in that national unity agreement there is acceptance of the Arab League peace initiative, which we've heard it may well be. And there are people in the government of Israel today, even in Kadima, very significant people who are interested in reaching an agreement, and I might add a comprehensive agreement of the type that is proposed by the Arab Peace Initiative and the concerns of the Arab states for peace within the region itself. There are people, very important people in the government today, who do favor talks with Syria, who do favor going for a comprehensive agreement and an examination of the Arab Peace Initiative. And finally, I believe that Prime Minister Olmert is a pragmatist, and when I do believe, and I think I can say that with some knowledge, that when he came to power, he did have an interest in and a belief that it was necessary for Israel to leave most of the occupied territories. I think he does feel and does clearly agree with this two-state solution and the need to end the conflict or get as close to ending the conflict as possible. But on the other hand, he's certainly intent on staying in power. He is indeed a weak leader. And what he may do, one can only guess, but what he may do is go for or try to initiate small steps of some kind of talks with Abu Mazen. But I don't think this will work. I think it's patently clear that it will not work. I'm not sure the Palestinians will agree to just small conversations, some dialogue, perhaps mainly around the prisoner issue, without going for real, genuine discussions of a final peace agreement, what we call the final status issues. But more importantly than that, I don't believe that small measures, some kind of dialogue just for the sake of dialogue, of having some kind of process, I do not believe, I think it's patently clear that that will not lead to security for Israel. It will not lead to an end of the conflict. The only way that we'll be able to stop the violence, and it is the violence that is pushing Israel to look for some kind of path to take. The violence will not be ended by partial agreements or by a peace process, in quotes. Sooner or later, even if there is a ceasefire, it will halt. And I think all the parties today are beginning to realize this. I would certainly hope that in Israel there is an understanding of this, that if we indeed do want to reach an end to the violence, whether it's the Qassam rockets coming from Gaza or if it's the rearming and some kind of trouble in the future once again with Hezbollah, the strengthening of the Islamic militants in the region, if we want any of this to come to an end, or at least to be able to tackle it, we have to reach agreement, and I think we have to reach a comprehensive agreement, not just another few steps to maybe come with some kind of interim agreement and quote confidence building measures and the like. We have to, I think the time is particularly serious in terms of the need to sit down and once again try to tackle the big issues. And I do believe that the Arab League Peace Initiative offers a basis for doing this. Anything short of that is going to be purely temporary and will not solve our problem. So I think that's where we are. Unfortunately, I think the only thing that's going to bring this about will be pressure from within Israel on the part of people who believe, and I think public opinion is there, that the military path may be necessary, but is certainly not doing the trick. It is not sufficient. And therefore, pressure from within Israel, but I think also the United States is key in this. I say it with a degree of sadness because I'm not convinced that this is a government here in Washington, an administration that is willing to take up this issue once again. But I am hopeful that the interconnectedness that became clear during the summer of the problems in the Middle East, with the Arab-Israeli conflict, the Palestinian issue, and the growing threat of Islamic militancy, that this interconnectedness will lead to a change in Washington's attitude. Thank you.
Galia, thank you very much. Before we turn to the discussion, and we have quite a bit of time left, I want to offer a few brief observations, primarily about American policy and the American role, in an effort to bring some measure of perspective before we start the discussion in the Q&A. Having worked for 4 administrations, and I'm now looking at the policies of the Nixon and Carter administrations for a book that I'm doing, I've come to the inescapable conclusion over the past 30 years that governing is really about choosing. That's what it means to govern. It means to set a number of priorities and invest in those priorities. This administration, over the course of the last 6 years, has chosen to invest itself in a variety of other priorities, 3 in particular: Iraq, Iran, and the war against terror. It has never seen, and in my estimation does not see now, the important link that exists between the pursuit of Arab-Israeli peace and the advancement of the objectives that it really does care about. It has never made that linkage, and I'm not entirely persuaded that a presentation of a report by Lee Hamilton and my former boss, Jim Baker, will lead them to that conclusion. In part, the absence of investing in the Arab-Israeli issue developmentally came from a number of things. It came in the beginning, and I worked for this administration for 2 years, from the ABC phenomenon, the anything but Clinton. That was something, I think, that dominated the first year of the administration's approach. Then, of course, there was 9/11 and the 9/11 paradigm, which imposed certain realities on an administration, which made it almost impossible to do serious diplomacy, because the parties, some of them involved in the diplomacy, were engaged in behaviors that the administration simply, in some respects rightly, could never have accepted. But above all, I would argue, the real reason the administration has not invested and may not choose to invest is fear of failure. And I disagree with Yasser on one critical issue. Failure is bad. And trying and failing, rather than not trying at all, which was a policy that we pursued during the last administration with respect to permanent status negotiations, needs to be thought through very carefully. Because in life, the world's most compelling ideology is not nationalism, it's not democracy, it's not even capitalism. It is success. That's the world's most compelling ideology, because success breeds power and success generates constituents. The Americans cannot afford, in this region right now, I would argue, given the stakes involved, another failure on the Arab-Israeli peace process. Right now, the situation with respect to serious negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians, it seems to me, looks rather grim. The 3 elements that are required to create an environment, let alone to consummate agreements right now, simply does not exist. I agree with the consensus here that we have leaders who are not masters of their politics. They are prisoners of their politics. Sharon arguably had the power to conclude an agreement, a permanent status agreement with Palestinians, but he lacked the incentive. Abu Mazen, on the other hand, had the incentive, but he lacked the power. The real question is whether Mr. Olmert and Mr. Abu Mazen today have either the incentive or the power to deal with the 4 core issues that separate Israelis and Palestinians: Jerusalem, borders, refugees, and security. It's a question worth asking and trying to answer. Second, there is no third party. There is no third party willing or able right now to take on a permanent status negotiation of a serious character. And finally, there is no mutually agreed framework under which the parties are negotiating. Now, one could, seems to me, be assembled quite easily based on all of the good work that has been done between 1999 and now. But Oslo is no longer an approach, and going immediately into permanent status negotiations, in my judgment, would almost certainly guarantee failure. So the question then becomes what to do. Let me just conclude by offering up one possible approach. If you had a willful president who was determined to make the pursuit of Arab-Israeli peacemaking a top priority, not even the top priority, but a top priority between now and the end of his administration, based around the following concept: we will not achieve between now and January of 2009 two states living in peace and security. We will not achieve that. That is almost unimaginable. But we might achieve a transformation of the current environment and create an environment that would still allow the least bad solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict to be seriously negotiated. Two states living side by side in peace and security. That is the critical distinction. No Palestinian state by January 2009, but an environment that would sustain a negotiation to achieve one. Toward that end, I would offer, and I realize it's a huge leap of logic and rationality under these circumstances, I would offer not one roadmap, but three. Sometimes when you can't fix a problem, the only solution is to broaden it. It's a paradox. Why create more problems for yourself when you can't fix the one that you've already got? But creating a broader net and a broader set may offer you tools to affect the problem as a whole. So I would suggest, and I realize it's unimaginable, three roadmaps. The first is the Israeli-Palestinian roadmap, focused not necessarily around a particular concept which is in the roadmap today. I noticed this morning that the Israeli press is full of rumors and reports that Mr. Olmert brought a plan based on consensual realignment to Washington. Consensual realignment. Significant Israeli withdrawal from the West Bank, sans the settlement blocks. Not imposed or unilaterally determined, but negotiated with Abu Mazen and the putative government that remains to be formed. Perhaps that is a possibility, but you need an envoy dedicated to resolving this problem, and you've got to go at it from a security, economic, and political perspective. That's an Israeli-Palestinian roadmap. Second, you need an Arab state roadmap. A consensus among Arab states, not necessarily on Beirut, but on the kinds of practical steps that key Arab states are prepared to take economically and politically with regard to Palestinians and Israelis as the Israeli-Palestinian roadmap evolves and moves forward. And finally, you need an American roadmap. An American roadmap that sometime between now and the end of this administration lays out on two pieces of paper what the Bush parameters are with respect to permanent status. I would throw my body in front of any effort to create right now a permanent status negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians on these four core issues. It will fail for all of the reasons all of us know well. It will fail. But creating an environment around such a U.S. roadmap to reaffirm the desirability and the feasibility that we in fact still believe in permanent status negotiations based on requirements acceptable to Israelis and Palestinians, that could provide the one thing that is lacking from the current situation: direction and hope. So let me stop there. I'd like to ask each of our panelists a question, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. To the two of you, Matan and Yasser. Yasser, you for the moment are Abu Mazen. You are sitting in a yet-to-be-scheduled summit meeting with Ehud Olmert. Matan, you are Ehud Olmert. And Yasser,
I came all the way that you will insult me. Okay.
well, how about this? You are the Prime Minister of Israel. Yasser, if you had to tell the Prime Minister of Israel, what are the 2 or 3 things that he could do now in a practical way, consistent with the world in which he lives, and you know that world, that would generate more trust and confidence on the part of Palestinians, what would they be?
Well, I don't know if 3 issues are enough, but I'll do my best. We have a long list, as you know, starting with the wall and the root of the wall, ending with the settlement activities which are continuing, and the cantonization of the Palestinian territories, which is a process that is going on. And if this process will continue, and it is continuing, I don't know, after 2 or 3 years, 5 years maximum, let me be more open, say between 5 and 10 years, I don't know if a person like me will sit here and even think of a solution called two-state solution. So number one, if you have a real interest in the future of your people, my people, the relations between these 2 nations in the future, and the relations between Israel and the Arab world, you have to reverse the actions you are taking concerning these basic issues, the settlements, the wall, and the cantonization of the Palestinian areas and territories. Nowadays, there are roads I cannot take inside the West Bank. These roads are only for Israelis. Nowadays, there are places around the towns and villages, places like the agricultural areas of these towns and villages that I cannot approach because they are separated from our towns and villages by the wall. Now, I don't want to add, this is number one issue. You have to address this, otherwise in 5, 10 years, I will call as a Palestinian for one state with equal rights for all the citizens of that state. It's not my choice. I don't like it. I hate it. See, I think it's dangerous for both, but you don't leave me with any other option. This is number one. The remaining 2, I leave them for you. You choose whatever you like.
Mr. Prime Minister.
I agree with Yasser 100%. The meaning is to stop terror. If there will be no terror, the whole region will be changed immediately. No roadblocks, no areas of agriculture that you can't reach, nothing. So what the Prime Minister, the President, President Abbas must do is to stop terror. And the terror is handled by the Hamas. And the Hamas are the ministers and the prime ministers from the Hamas. So for me, it's very easy. He just have to decide to stop Qassam launching against the Negev, the western part of the Negev. Think about it. Since the withdrawal from Gaza, more than 1,000 missiles have been launched to the western area of the Negev, including Ashkelon and Sderot. You heard about it. So the only minor thing, just stop terror. That's it. The moment there will be no terror, the whole mood will be changed and I really believe and I support what Galia just said about sustaining negotiation. It's much more important than anything else in this situation of today, because if not sustain negotiation, it will be preparing to war, it will be continuing of terror. So I need, as a minister, as a Prime Minister of Israel, only one thing: no terror from the other side. After several weeks, the whole mood will be changed. I remember 2 years ago, I don't remember the days, but I remember 3 weeks without terror acts. You can't believe it. It's only 3 weeks. It's nothing. The whole mood in Israel changed immediately. And I agree again 100% with Galia about the outcomes of the last war, of the previous, it's not the last, the previous war in Lebanon. The moment that people will understand that using force you can't solve nothing, not using the IDF, not using the terror organizations of the other side, the whole mood will be changed. And this is the most important thing for Israelis and Palestinians as well.
Okay. Galia and Amjad, the two of you are sitting in the Oval Office with the President of the United States, George W. Bush, and he is seriously prepared to engage on the Israeli-Palestinian track. But he needs something from each of you. So I have two questions. What would that something be to encourage American involvement if fear of failure is in fact the greatest obstacle that stands in the way of serious American involvement? How do you encourage an administration that has a fear of failure and great skepticism to engage? And what one thing, assuming you're prepared to stand up and do what you need to do, would you identify for the president that he must do immediately to demonstrate his seriousness? Galia?
Well, the question is, when you say what would I do, what would I want to see done here, or what would I do at home? I suspect that, let's just say we're not dealing with the present administration, but an abstract administration. Is that okay?
Well, that makes it easy then.
We're dealing with this administration.
Okay. Well, I can tell you what I'd like to see. What I'd like to see is a result of the commission on the study group on Iraq to come up with a recommendation that the way to resolve American problems in Iraq is to go for a package deal, which will involve Syria and Iraq, that is to say, the Syrian border with Iraq and Syrian involvement with the resistance in Iraq, in exchange for renewed relations, a decent relationship with the United States, that has within it a package that includes the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, again, as I said before, because of the need to remove that instrument from the hands of Iran and from the hands of the Islamic militants. That's what I would hope would happen, that there would be sufficient thinking, that there would be thinking here, both of the study group, and I would assume that what it also needs is strong support for this within the now Democratic Congress and the American Jewish community. I think that would certainly be important, and I think that there's a great deal of sentiment which may not be expressed by the establishment of the Jewish community in the United States, but I think that there is a great deal of support amongst the Jewish community in the United States for resolution of this conflict, a two-state solution, and negotiations to end the conflict, and not just Israel holding out and not doing anything. That's what I think should come from here. Inside Israel, I think what's extremely important is that the message be conveyed that public opinion is consistently over the past 6-7 years, consistently in favor of the two-state solution, of getting out of most or all of the territories and taking down most or all of the settlements. The settlement movement has been defeated in Israel. Doesn't mean the next time round it won't be difficult. It will be difficult to move people, but the major battle has been fought and won, and the settlers do not have the kind of support that they need in order to torpedo a peace agreement. I think the message has to be conveyed clearly from Israel that while Israelis certainly respond and support, I do not, but most Israelis do support military response to Qassam rockets and violence and terrorism, nonetheless the majority of Israelis do want to see an end to the conflict. And so I think that has to be conveyed from the Israeli public as well.
Thank you. Amjad?
Well, I think that maybe 1 year ago even, this administration would not have thought that the Iraq policy was a failure. And some people may have privately admitted so, but I think some people were still unwilling to even admit privately that the Iraq policy is a failure. And now, because of changes in our own electoral politics, there's a need to acknowledge that it's not working. I would start by telling the president, Iraq is a failure. U.S. policy with North Korea is a failure. The policy in Afghanistan is failing. The policy with Iran is not working. Policy with Syria and Lebanon is not working. And where would you put the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in that context? That too is a failure. It's as much a disaster in an existential sense as the Iraq disaster is. The Iraq disaster has more immediate ramifications for U.S. national security interests, but the Israeli-Palestinian one is it's like the underlying coal that's going to keep the flames burning even as the attempt to resolve Iraq or come up with a policy to begin to repair the damage from the failed policy in Iraq begins. So the Israeli-Palestinian it's as necessary to change policy on Israel-Palestine as it is on Iraq and as it is on Afghanistan. However, they cannot be done separately anymore. Now, what can the Palestinians offer? The Palestinians have only one coin, only one, and they've only had one coin for a long time, which is the moral rightness of their cause for the entire Muslim world and for the Arab world. That's it. It's not that the Palestinian leadership can rally anybody. It's not that the Palestinian leadership, as it were, can convince Nasrallah is now far more popular than any Palestinian figure will ever be. So it's not that the Palestinian leadership has that capacity. It's that the Palestinian cause has that capacity to mobilize and capture the imagination of people throughout the world, not just in the Muslim world and the Arab world, but primarily in the Muslim world and the Arab world. And an honest and sincere attempt to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has knock-on effects everywhere. And if it is done in parallel with an attempt to deal with Iran and Syria, to engage Iran and Syria on issues relating to Iraq and Lebanon, they will also deal with Israel and Palestine. And unfortunately now, it used to be that the Palestinians argued that resolving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict was the issue that would make everything in the Middle East go away. It would make every problem go away. Well, that's not true anymore. I mean, we've made it not true. Now there are so many problems in the Middle East that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict may be a necessary ingredient to resolve, but it won't be enough by itself. And similarly, in order to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we're going to have to deal with Iran and Syria, and we're going to have to deal with Iran and Syria in the context of Lebanon and Iraq, as well as Israel and Palestine. But the advantage is that right now, besides the advantages that you laid out, the opportunities that presented themselves, Israel having lost the war for the first time since the first 5 days of the 73 war, Israel being in a more chastened position, the Arabs being a little bit more confident, self-confident to make peace overtures. You have, again, every one of the Arab states saying we are prepared to enter into negotiations with Israel. You have everyone in the region recognizing, even Iran and Syria, recognizing that stability in the region is more to their advantage if they can cut a deal than instability. And U.S. policy currently promotes instability. So if we can go into these parallel track negotiations, you want an envoy, Aaron, you mentioned the necessity of an envoy, and I agree. But we need more than one envoy. We need an envoy. You said 3 roadmaps, and I thought you were going to say that we need one for Iraq, we need one for Palestine, and we need one for Iran. I believe that that's where it's going to require an unparalleled, I mean, this has never been done, I think, by the United States before, but it's going to require multiple track diplomacy, parallel, coordinating and complementary at a level of skill that we haven't seen yet. So that's not necessarily the most convincing argument for the president.
Okay, we're done up here. Let's go to questions from all of you. Who'd like to start? Yes.
Stanley Koger with the Cato Institute. Does Iran have a veto over this process because of its influence with Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah? I have to assume the panelists don't think it does, so if you could explain that.
Does Iran have a veto over the pursuit of Israeli-Palestinian peace? Who would like to answer that?
I think. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to say that vetoes only work if you give legitimacy to the veto. Iran doesn't have the physical capacity to be a veto on the Israeli-Palestinian track. But if you want to give, you can give not just Iran a veto. If you want, you can give Syria a veto, you can give Hezbollah a veto, you can give Hamas a veto. You can, in fact, give Islamic Jihad, or you can give a militia, a subset militia of Tanzim that reports to nobody and isn't responding to anyone, a veto. I think that Iran does have a role to play, and it can be positive or negative.
No, I think you misunderstood me. It's sort of like, if there is progress, what did Mr. Vilnai say? You can always launch a few Qassams. You can always kidnap a soldier. Mm-hmm. That's what I mean.
And that's what I meant too. I understood what you meant. So when an Israeli soldier is taken prisoner, if you've decided it's a national security objective to pursue a peace agreement, what are you going to allow another country to interfere in your own national security pursuit because they've interfered by taking a soldier prisoner? That's the question.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say, though, the situation has become much more complicated in the last several years. I would argue Iran does not have a veto, but it has a voice, and its voice is expressed through 2 non-state actors who have demonstrated in the past 2 years one basic proposition, that small entities are capable of affecting events on a very broad scale. I mean, when you think about Iran's investment in the Hezbollah, Iran kept the entire world, and I never saw anything like it since I've been out of government, the amount of interest, media attention, and breathlessness that was applied to the Israeli-Lebanon war. Iran kept the world on the edge of its seat for 30 days. 30 days as a consequence of a reasonably low-tech investment in Hezbollah in Lebanon. So a voice, not a veto, and a voice that will grow louder in the event you don't have a serious process to manage the Israeli-Palestinian issue.
In the Middle East, the veto is very simple. It's just a Katyusha rocket or a bus exploded in the middle of Tel Aviv, and this is a veto. And terror acts will change the whole mood immediately for both sides.
Yes.
Yeah, I have a question for Mr. Matan. You talked about the Islamization of the conflict these days, and I think there must be reasons for that. I think the Israeli practices recently against the Palestinians encouraging that. Second, the failure of the Palestinian national movement to achieve peace. So also that's adding to it. So do you expect when people saw what happened in Beit Hanun last week, what message that will send to Israel? Then I would say on Oslo, Peretz and Rabin decided to go to Oslo because they don't want the conflict to take an Islamic or religious conflict. Where the Israelis trying to go today, if they are seeing the Islamic movements are against the Israelis because of their behavior, what the alternative the Israelis have today? To have wars, to talk to them, not to deal with anyone? So what choices do we have today?
I'm sure that you know very well what is Hamas agenda. Hamas agenda is against any non-Muslim identity state in the Middle East. You know it very well. And therefore, we have to speak with the other side that basically is not against you, because this is the conflict, but they don't believe that you have to exist. That's a big difference. It's really a big difference. And you know it very well. And therefore, we have a problem. And you can speak about Bet Hanun, and you will be absolutely right. But you have to remember that hundreds of missiles have been launched from Bet Hanun. You know it very well as well. The moment that we left Gaza, completely, not completely, 99%, you must take it as an advantage and to show us and to show the whole world how you can run Gaza as a civilian society, not as a terror base. And if you enter now Gaza and see what's happened now in Gaza, it will be less, it will be worse than South Lebanon. It's only a matter of time. It's a very short time. As using a terror base against Israel, because Israel is not there, because Israel had no right to exist. This is the problem. And we have to discuss with Hamas daily about the peace process. At night, they will launch rockets. And again, in the morning, we discuss again the peace process. How we can do it.
Yes. Yes. Hmm?
And from the National Endowment for Democracy. I have to say that the answer of taking on the role of Abu Mazen and Omer and answering the question really depressed me, because it seems that while there's empathy in talking about where certain the confidence measures need to lie, there's also sort of an incompatibility. I don't know how you can overcome this deadlock if there's not a recognition on the Israeli side that there's some sort of causal relationship between terrorism and continued policies on the ground. I mean, as much as I understand the argument about Hamas, presenting an existential sort of threat against Israel, I mean, we can go back, as we have all discussed. I mean, this is a result of a failure of processes that have been going on since Oslo. So it can't just be restricted, discussing whether or not you address terrorism can't just be restricted to talking about Hamas and their current agenda. At what point do Israelis or do the Israeli government address any sort of, or is there ever going to be a point where there can be, without accepting terrorism as a legitimate instrument for achieving ends, at what point does one address the causal relationship, if at all, given the very clear and evident humanitarian sort of aspects of what Israeli policies do on the ground to average Palestinians who are oftentimes not, people who are calling for the end of Israel?
I'm not sure that I understand the question.
Is there? Let me just take one piece of it.
Can I?
Do you want to?
Yeah, I do think. I think one of the basic things is that we got Hamas in quotes because of an election, and the election was the result of a tremendous disillusionment, I believe, on the part of the Palestinians in the path of negotiations, in the efforts of Abu Mazen in the past. It didn't produce results. And I think that a critical thing here is to, if we don't have a situation where Hamas is willing to change its attitude towards Israel, that is to say, if we do not have a national unity government in which there is a basis for Hamas to agree to negotiations, then the object will be to weaken it. And weakening it means negotiations. Weakening it means doing something with Abu Mazen. Because clearly to talk about a situation in which there's been a total boycott with nothing going in and nothing going out, and therefore bringing about a tremendous situation of deprivation, inside the Gaza Strip is not something that's going to weaken Hamas, by the way. It merely strengthens them. The conclusion is not, oh, this is a bad government, we got to get rid of it, which usually is not the case. It usually brings about the opposite. The way in which I think to weaken Hamas is to strengthen Abu Mazen. And this is something that we have not been doing. Basically, this is something we weren't doing long before the elections as well. And that's why I think that the only answer really is returning to the negotiating table. The question is, and Matan raised it, is can you do this while there's still violence? And I think that it is logical and it's reasonable to demand a ceasefire on both sides. On both sides. That means ending the targeted assassinations, the incursions into Gaza. It also means ending the Qassam rockets. But I'm not sure that we can wait for that, and I'm not sure it has to be dependent upon that. I think that particularly when we look at history with past movements, national liberation movements, and conflicts of this type, very often you have to negotiate under violence. It's unfortunate. It's not desirable. But if we continue, because we've been at this stalemate for a long time. The roadmap was never started because of the demand for absolute quiet before you even move. If we permit this to continue to stop us, if we permit this obstacle to remain, we're only going to see a growing strength of these more radical elements. And by the way, inside Israel as well, because the response inside Israel is Lieberman. When you have continued violence on both sides. We've seen this for so long that it's impossible, it's almost impossible for me to comprehend why this is not perceived, that the use of violence on both sides has gotten us absolutely nowhere.
And you have to understand that the supporter of Lieberman, what you present, are the Hamas. You understand it very well. Because of their acts of terror, the Israelis are becoming afraid. And therefore, both sides need to have the ceasefire. And this is the most important thing. And when we start Oslo, many years ago, it's September 93, we were sure that in this time, after more than 10 years, the whole area will be changed. And the late Prime Minister Rabin, he used to say it. And if he would have been murdered, and Hamas would not have come to power on the Palestinian side, I'm sure that the whole situation was different. I'm sure about it. And therefore, Hamas is a problem, not because Hamas is in power, but because this is, we feel, the will of the Palestinian people. I'm sure that it's wrong. But this is the feeling in Israel. Not because they are in power, but because the Israelis are seeing every Palestinian as a Hamas, and it's wrong. I know that it's wrong. I'm sure that he is not Hamas. I know it. And thousands. No. He's afraid as well, you see? He's afraid as well. This is the problem. And therefore, coming to the basics, it's terror. It's the use of power. It's the use of force, and because you believe that you can reach something with this. And this is the main issue now in the Middle East. This is the main issue, not only in the Middle East, but in our case, in the Middle East.
Can I just offer one additional perspective on this from the standpoint of a mediator? You know, there's terror and violence, and there's terror and violence. And in the 90s, when there was a negotiation, a meaningful, serious negotiation, we had acts of violence. But there's a difference. Entities must have a monopoly over the forces of violence within their societies if, in fact, they're going to be credible to their constituents and their neighbors. It's a fact of life. Whether it's the District of Columbia or the government of Syria or the city of Chicago, polities must control all of the guns. It may seem unfair given the realities of the Israeli occupation. It may seem unfair given the oppression that Palestinians face, denial of their rights. But there's a certain reality from the perspective of the mediator. If Israelis and Palestinians want to negotiate with one another in the face of sporadic and episodic violence, which is perpetrated by or acquiesced in by the authorities with whom they're dealing, that's Israel's choice. But I suspect that from the mediator's perspective, from the perspective of this government, and particularly this administration, that insists on moral clarity and consistency in terms of who's on the right or wrong side of terror and violence, good luck trying to persuade this administration to buy off on anything other than a consolidation and control on the part of the Palestinian Authority of the guns.
Can I add one thing here?
Sure.
Look, well, we know all, I think, that the American administration gives priority to the issue of terror. And we had experienced for a very long time, even during the previous administrations, that this issue has two faces. On one hand, it is the result of the conditions that had prevailed because of the occupation, and I'm not justifying it here, but because there is something, a major thing which is wrong and continuing to be wrong, and that is occupation. Occupation is the source of violence at the beginning. And you have these groups that had developed, and sometimes they were very marginal, sometimes they are basic players now, because we are not solving politically the problem of the occupation in a correct way. They exploit, they manifest, they use these conditions for their benefit, and they continue to do that. And they are expanding and growing because the issue, the major issue, is not addressed in a correct way. This is number one. Number two, if we know what is Hamas' agenda or the agenda of these groups, why do we fall in the same trap all the time? If we know that they want to escalate, they want to continue without taking into consideration what will be the losses among the civilians. If we know that, if we say that, why don't we do something to stop it? And to stop it, to show the public in both sides that there is an alternative to violence. Now in the Middle East, everywhere from Darfur to Afghanistan, there are political initiatives, including talks, secret talks or open talks, with the groups that carry weapons. And there are so many news about attempts to start talks, not with the Zarqawi type of criminals, but with the so-called resistance groups inside Iraq. Under fire, under fire. I'm not asking for negotiations with these groups in Palestine. I'm asking for something which is much more less than that. Negotiations with the groups and forces that oppose them. Those who oppose them. This is the problem. I mean, we don't have here a logic which is really coherent with the reasons that we all admit, we all see, and we all also believe that if we don't address them today, they will get worse and worse, more dangerous and more dangerous tomorrow, and they will threaten our future. One last thing is, we have today Tony Blair, because he will be jobless in few months, is calling for addressing the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. and he's showing his personal readiness to do that. I know so many other leaders, yani, sorry to say, all of those who are only jobless, who are showing their readiness. And there are high expectations today concerning the Baker-Hamilton report or whatever it is. I don't think they will invent the wheel. I don't think they will show us something which we don't know. We know it. It's there. It's in the roadmap. It's in the Mitchell's report. Amjad reminded me of that, although I was appointed as the Palestinian, you see, representative with the Mitchell's report, and so many other things. It's there. It needs, okay. Mr. Vilnai said that there are so many weak leaders we have, the Palestinian leader, the Israeli leader, and the American leaders. I was very happy, by the way, because at least we are on equal footing with the Americans and the Israelis considering this issue.
Yes.
Thank you. Eric Paulson from the Norwegian Embassy. I would like to ask you, Mr. Miller, if a comprehensive international conference, a Madrid-like thing, would that fit into the approach you were advocating, the 3 roadmaps, etc., with a view to creating a more conducive environment for the two-state solution? Thank you.
I would just say very briefly, conferences are good for 2 reasons. One, to start a process, and the other, to conclude it. It took 9 months and 9 trips by former Secretary of State Baker, 8 trips, in order to create a negotiating framework called Madrid, which was quite consequential, even though it led to 10 rounds of unsuccessful negotiations in Washington. So I would not invest heavily in this particular problem in a conference. As a symbolic effort to initiate or to conclude, it could have great value and utility, but it will never be, given the complexities of these issues, a forum for serious negotiations between Arabs and Israelis.
It's time we get more hands.
Ryan?
I heard you mention that one of the things that needs to happen is some kind of weakening of Hamas to move forward. And regarding weakening Hamas and going forward with negotiations, it seems I kind of want to get your perspective on whether you think everybody thinks that's a good idea or not, because I mean, whether you like it or not, Hamas is elected and their popularity is high, and that's a fact, and they're not necessarily going to go away. And you could make the point also that since they've been in power, I mean, arguably Israelis have actually been safer in a sense. I mean, though there are Qassam rockets going into Israel every day, it's far better than before 2014 Intifada. And so what worries me is when you talk about marginalizing Hamas and pushing them out of power, is what happens after that. They go back to the kind of resistance Intifada-like program that they had before, and what the possible dangers in marginalizing them might be.
Yasser, do you want to take that one?
I'll take that one, and I'll use the opportunity to continue what I was going to say in the past question. Look, there are things, frankly, that maybe I will hint at. I'm not going to say clear. I agree totally with Aaron that when he said that any authority, whether it's a municipality or a country or state, has obligations, and these obligations are, one basic thing of them is to guarantee law and order, to prevent violence, etc., etc. Now, it's a unique condition for the unique conditions of Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority is that at the same time we are asked to fulfill our commitments as a state. We are not a state, and we are deprived of all the basic needs and the requirements of a state. This is a real problem. You know how much we need to negotiate, for example, and with how many parties we need to negotiate and for how long in order to bring a few hundred stupid rifles to arm the Palestinian security forces. And the Palestinian security forces in Gaza, the official ones, are the weakest among the different groups and militias. This is very unique. I don't think any other state or country need that. And until now, we didn't succeed even in those negotiations, although superpowers had interfered to negotiate and to participate and to mediate in these negotiations. It's a real problem. If we need to strengthen our authority, we need a level of cooperation between the peace forces in the region, all the peace forces. And this level of cooperation starts with minor steps of security and ends with politics. If we don't do that, see, I don't guarantee anything. And that's why I believe that there is there are certain things that we all acknowledge. There is a danger of growing extremism, fundamentalism, etc., etc., etc. But we don't have a joint platform which is agreed upon between all those forces that face extremism and fundamentalism about what are the priorities and how and in what ways, and depending on which forces we can counter extremism. We have no basic agreement. We have different and sometimes even contradicting plans and strategies in the region, and that is one reason why we had faced failure in many cases, and I don't only include Iraq here, maybe there are other places. Thank you.
We have time for two more questions, one of which will have to be from the fifth floor under threat of banishment if I don't answer it. So why don't we do one more question and then we'll answer this one, or try to. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Joel Rayburn. I'm from U.S. Central Command. In recent weeks, it seemed that Fatah and Hamas were on the verge of civil conflict themselves that seemed to be independent of their relationship with the Israelis. So my question to the panel is, how can you restart an Israeli-Palestinian peace process if you don't have a Palestinian-Palestinian peace process?
I guess that would be best answered by
By the way, yes.
You have to bring them several hundred stupid rifles and you solve the problem.
Well, I don't know if in previous history we had unanimous support for peace negotiations and talks, whether in Israel or in Palestine or even in the region. And I don't think that this happened in the past. We had chosen a difficult path, which is the path of negotiations, trying the peace process. Sometimes we failed, most of the times we failed, but with very slight successes. Nowadays, yes, we have internal Palestinian problems, and these problems arise of the also unique conditions where we are practicing democracy, elections, building Palestinian institutions of a state where there is no state. There is no independent state. And the world is asking us to do things that are beyond our capabilities, you see. So I'm not saying this to justify issues, but if we are an independent state, I think maybe the results of the elections will be different. Maybe. And if we are an independent state, maybe we will respond, we will be able to respond to some kind of violence, some kind of breaking law and order in a totally different way. Because our abilities then will be different. See? So take these conditions into consideration. We are in a situation where at one level we need to have some kind of national reconciliation internally, and at the other hand we need to start some kind of a process with our neighbors and our occupiers at the same time in order to find a solution for the major issue, which is the occupation and the independence.
Can I just say something to that?
Sure.
The truth is, I think we can find a whole list of reasons not to negotiate. Not just that they're fighting each other, or they're weak, or they're Islamists, or they're not democratic, or the Palestinian state. You can't make peace except with the democratic states, so that they'll have corruption, whatever. And I can give you a list. The question really is if we want to bring about an end to this conflict or not. And it's not an intellectual question. It's not an intellectual question. There is an ongoing conflict which is taking lives every day. It's not something that we can just say, well, until they do this or until they do that, until they're the perfect state or not a state. And I think that's the problem here. We had a strong leader amongst the Palestinians. His name was Arafat. We didn't particularly like him, and we didn't negotiate. In the end, we didn't negotiate with him. We did negotiate for a while. Then we got another leader that we did like, but we didn't negotiate with them. And now, of course, the situation is that we've got Hamas, undeniable, and we've got Khalid Mashal sitting in Damascus, who seems to be pulling some strings with Hamas. The question is, do we try to break this and say, okay, whatever the situation is, there still is an elected government there, there's an elected president, there still is an authority with which we can negotiate. The same thing I can say, by the way, on the Israeli side. Yes, it's absolutely true. We have a weak government today. We have a weak leader. And we've got elements in the government who clearly are not interested in negotiations. But if we can bring both sides to negotiate at the level of the elected leaders, and then that does have to see. We do have to see if we can put it into effect. We have to implement this. There's no question that you ultimately have to engage all sides. It's quite true that if we reach an agreement and Hamas hasn't been brought on board, or if its position within the Palestinian community hasn't been weakened electorally, so that it can torpedo any kind of agreement, that's a problem. And that clearly we have to reach an agreement that can be supported by both sides. And we know the agreement. We know the parameters are out there. It's very clear to everybody. It's very clear to everybody in Israel, by the way, and the Palestinians, what the parameters of an agreement are going to be. It's really quite clear. And we can, of course, create more and more obstacles, and they can create more and more obstacles. But what is needed is an act of will at this point. And I don't say that it'll be easy to sell to the publics. Not saying that there aren't extremists amongst the Palestinians and that there aren't extremists also amongst Israelis. But I think that an agreement can be sold. But the first point has to be to sit down and talk. And the whole issue of trust and believing each other and so on is something that comes afterwards and not first.
Last question. There are two from the fifth floor. Both concern the role of the American-Israel Public Affairs Committee and its influence on American Middle East policy. In a minute, there's almost no way I'm going to be able to answer that, but I will say this. I think that the role of AIPAC in influencing and guarding an already predisposed pro-Israeli case in Congress is extremely significant. This is a system, our system, that's designed to be lobbied. Whether it's the NRA, the ARP, the tobacco lobby, it is literally a system uniquely constructed to allow interest groups to make their case, and through politics, campaign contributions, and compelling arguments to sway their elected representatives. And I would argue to you that it's certainly not a conspiracy, but the American Israel Public Affairs Committee has a very significant role in influencing congressional attitudes and aid levels. Its role is much less significant, however, in shaping the contours of America's Middle East policy when it comes to negotiations between Arabs and Israelis. Thank you all for coming. We almost made it by 10:30. We'll have a short break and be back with our panel on Israel, Syria, and Lebanon, chaired by Dennis Ross. Thank you very much.
תודה רבה. אני לא כל כך אופטימי אחרי המלחמה.
אני יודעת, אבל אני לא יכולה לקום בבוקר אם אני לא אופטימית. מה אני אעשה?
זה נראה אחר. זה עניין אחר.
אני מוכרחה למצוא משהו.
זה עניין אחר. הלוואי, הלוואי. אני ממש פסיבה. אשתי, היא 35 שנה איתי, אומרת אף פעם לא ראיתי אותה. חודשים היא אומרת. מצב לא טוב. מחר בכל.
United the front.
אני שונא את זה. לא הסכמתי לנסוע לפרנקפורט.
No, I better request.
Guys stamp parking tickets.
אני שונא את הנמל תעופה שלך.
Just wanted to ask in case. No, I just wanted to ask.
It was a great session. Okay, yeah, let's wait. Actually, if you can start taking away the water, I need to go get some paperwork that they need to sign.
עושים מה שהם רוצים רק שיעבור על זה. אני מכיר את זה.
אני לא חזרתי אף פעם דרך פרנקפורט.
Now just take the water out slowly.
I have to ask you something.
We should sit down.
מה אתה?
שהוא פוליטיקאי קטן, ממש מגעיל עוד כדי כמה. מנסה עכשיו לראות איזה רווח פוליטי יהיה לו. אני לא אעשה לו רווח פוליטי. אז הוא בודק, אולי דרוזי, אולי קיבוצניק. פוליטיקה. המיץ של הזבל. המיץ של הזבל. אולי זה.
לא, אבל שלא, אני יודעת, הצעירים, הבנות שלי
האמינו, בצד.
to the kitchen. We're gonna get new water pitchers, right? We're gonna need new water pitchers, right?
I haven't touched it. I mean, you know, in the sense that.
Here's the. This one's okay.
Yeah, there's only 4 cameras. So.
I'll take this and then come back.
I was saying I was going to put the new ones. Yeah, glasses are done. These are all new. So where, Holly, where do you want the 4 to sit? These 4?
Dennis Ross will sit in the middle. On his right, Itamar Rabinovich, and then Hisham Wilhelm, and next to, no, Hisham Wilhelm next to Itamar, and Joe Joti on the other side. So
Joti, Dennis.
Ross in the middle.
Okay. Dennis Ross, okay.
In the middle, he's the chair.
Okay.
And then Rabinovich, who is right next to Rabinovich, Hisham, and on the other side, Orhaf.
Okay.
That's it. We don't have.
So we should take off the last one, put it here.
Move the last chair from the other side. Gather the hands.
Okay, this is what we're going to do.
Should we seat them?
She wants them seated, like, yeah, bring that last one here. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Is there a napkin there? Can you just have it on yours? Oh, just one.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I grabbed 5.
It's just to dry off some more.
Do you know where Asusina said the 10 cards would be?
Oh, God.
I thought they were here, but I'll go look in the office.
Yeah, not sure. Oh, should we just remove it completely? Where should I put it?
You can put it in the hallway too.
Or yeah, that's
Sure.
Oh, yeah. Does that other one need some as well? And just put two? Okay. That one's got. Oh, that's, I know. That's fine. That's the most we can do. Oh, that needs to be thrown away here.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't want
Okay.
that to.
And we're all set?
So, so wait, sorry, just what's the deal with your form?
Could I ask you please to take your seat? We had an excellent panel from 8:45 to almost past 10:30, and we are now going to proceed with our second panel. I would like to thank once again all the panelists, and the second panel would be chaired by Ambassador Dennis Ross. I think it's the first time he's speaking at one of our Middle East program events, so a special welcome to you. Same for Ambassador Rabinovich. Hisham and Morhaf has spoken in our programs and previous events. We will follow the same pattern. We'll open the panel with some remarks by Ambassador Ross, move on to the panelists, and then some discussion between the panelists, open the floor, and we'll take also questions from the fifth floor. Again, to remind you to close your cell phones, please. Dennis, please.
Thank you.
Speak from there or from.
We'll do it from here. Thank you. After having listened to the first panel, obviously we got the easy job. After one deals with the Israelis and the Palestinians, where we know everything is so easy to handle, we decided that we would now move on to the Syrians, Lebanese, and Israelis, because, of course, this is vastly more tractable than the first problem. Let me start by trying to frame, I think, what should be our discussion. I don't know how many of you today saw the lead editorial in the Washington Post, but it was on Hezbollah basically trying to carry out a coup within Lebanon, and in effect either doing Syria's bidding or acting at Syria's request to frustrate an international tribunal that would be prosecuting those responsible for the killing of former Prime Minister Hariri. And it really sort of reminded me that there are different perceptions about where we are in the region as it relates to the Syrians. In this town in particular, I would say there are two schools of thought. One school says we really have to try to transform the region, and the Syrians have a marriage of convenience with Iran. They don't have a marriage of ideology with Iran. And if you wanted to strategically transform the region, you would try to deal with the Syrians, wean them away from the Iranians. If you did that, not only would you isolate the Iranians in the larger context, so they would no longer have a leading Arab ally, but you would also position yourself well on the other issues. As it relates to Lebanon, Syria is the key to preventing Hezbollah from being resupplied. 1701 doesn't really deal even with in a sense it deals with the issue of militias and disarmament, but the idea is that there's supposed to be an embargo, and the truth is we know that that's not taking place right now. So if you wanted to prevent the resupply of Hezbollah, the only way you're going to do it is by getting the Syrians to agree to prevent the resupply of Hezbollah. And if you really wanted to affect the Israeli-Palestinian issue, you could do so because the external leadership of Hamas is based in Damascus, seems to be calling the shots. So you could change the balance of forces among Palestinians by affecting the external Hamas. So in effect, Syria is a pivot as it relates to Iran, as it relates to Lebanon, and even as it relates to the Palestinian issue. So since it's a pivot, why not try to transform the region by engaging Syria and gain a major advantage? And since it's only a marriage of convenience, not a marriage of ideology with the Iranians, then the potential for such change is there. So engagement should be the hallmark of our policy right now. That's one school of thought. There's a different school of thought which says Bashar Assad has made a choice. He identifies with Hassan Nasrallah in a way that his father never did. He sort of sees Nasrallah, as many others do, as a folk hero in the region. And he sees the relationship here not just one of being cards to be traded away, but in effect, he identifies with the Iranians and he identifies with Hezbollah, and he sees Hamas as a basis on which to build the Syrian relationship in the region, Syrian leverage in the region. And he's made a fundamental strategic choice. And since he's made a strategic choice, it is fruitless to try to engage him. The efforts at previous engagement, certainly the administration would say this, the efforts at previous engagement haven't worked, and the behavior of the Syrians puts them on the wrong side of the war on terror. So it's wrong to engage the Syrians, and it's the last thing you ought to be doing. Now, those are two pretty clear schools of thought. Aaron talked about the administration operating on the basis of moral clarity, and they seem to have an attitude in this regard. I think this is an issue that certainly could be debated, but I think for the purposes of our panel, we really ought to see how we address that question. Where do you come out on this issue, and what does it mean for the United States? Should the United States be engaging the Syrians? Would it transform the situation in the region, or should the United States not be engaging the Syrians? Or is there a third way? Is there some hybrid where, in fact, you might, on the one hand, be engaging, but with more of a focus on sticks than on carrots? So with that as a kind of introduction and a framing of the issues, the only way I know to proceed in terms of asking each of the panelists to spend 10 minutes, I hope that they will engage that framing of the issues, but if they don't, when they finish, I'm going to sharpen my questions in a way that will try to draw them out on what I've just suggested. And the way I think best to proceed is, Muraf, we're going to start with you, and we'll just go down the panel in this direction, okay?
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ross. Thank you, Wilson Center, especially Dr. Esfandiari, for including me in this very prestigious group. I sit here, though I am not of the far right wing. Do not get that wrong, please. And as I always tell my students, there's never a boring moment in the Middle East, and I will add to that, especially that the Bush administration has made things far more eventful. With regard to the larger question of the options for the U.S., and here specifically vis-à-vis Syria, I would argue that the Washington sticks-only policy has failed to achieve its objectives. Although Syria implemented some measures to secure its border with Iraq, there apparently is still infiltration of jihadists, albeit at a very small number. Although Syria withdrew its forces from Lebanon, it still intervenes in the domestic affairs of Lebanon, although and also Syria continues to host Hamas. So again, these objectives of Washington have failed by using the sticks-only policy. Sanctions and threats and attempts to isolate Syria have backfired, in fact. Externally, the U.S. pressure has caused the Assad regime to shift from the Arab consensus towards Iran. And internally, that pressure has caused the regime to clamp down on what was once an emerging Syrian civil and human rights movement. So that shift on the part of Syria and that clampdown enabled the Assad regime to survive. Not only to survive, the Assad regime now feels more secure than it had been several months ago. Its Hezbollah protégé won a military victory against Israel. Its Hamas protégé won an electoral victory against Fatah, and its Iran patron is defying the United States and its allies. So that the US and its allies now seek to wean Syria away from Iran, I think reinforces the notion that the sticks-only policy has been counterproductive. Syrian mischief does not emerge in a vacuum. It's born out of fear. It is born out of a fear of encirclement by American power, a fear of a separate Israeli-Lebanese peace treaty, a fear of not recovering the Golan Heights from Israeli occupation. To entice Assad out of Iran's orbit, and better still to enlist Syrian cooperation, I think I am of the school of thought that says that Washington needs to talk to Damascus. and not just for the sake of talking, but in order to break the logjam in which the Middle East finds itself in. According to The Economist, Assad has several demands. 4, in fact. Again, this is according to The Economist. I do not know this from any sources inside Syria. Assad would like the UN to stop investigating Syria's role in the Hariri assassination. Assad would like a guarantee that America will not try to undermine his regime. He would like a return of Syria's influence in Lebanon. And he would like the return of the Golan Heights, which Israel occupied in 1967. Among these demands, I would say only the last one, namely the return of the Golan, is legitimate. There is not going to be any UN stopping investigating the Syrian role. The International Tribunal, I think, should proceed. The judges should be appointed. Whoever is suspect should be tried and convicted in this court of law, no matter where it is and no matter how high that leads. A return of Syria's influence in Lebanon, I think, is a lot of wishful thinking. The Lebanese do not want Syrian influence, and I think the Syrians are tired of influencing Lebanon. But again, it is that last demand that is legitimate. Israel has no business occupying Syrian territory, and the United States has no business in looking the other way as Israel consolidates still its hold on the Golan through settlements. In fact, the US has no business encouraging one party to the debate inside Israel as whether the Israelis should return to the talks with Syria. This is not right for a superpower that is a guarantor of international stability. Ideally, the return of the Golan to Syria creates a win-win situation for many, not for all, but for many. For Israel, I think peace with Syria would accomplish what it has sought throughout its history, and that is to be accepted in the region and to live within secure and recognized boundaries free from the threat of war. Peace with Syria removes a major part of that threat. Remember, at Shepherdstown in January 2000, in the Syrian-Israeli talks, Syria, according to the Clinton draft that was leaked to the press, had accepted, among other things, normalization of relations with Israel, which includes the establishment of an Israeli embassy, which includes the free flow of people and goods and services to and from Syria and Israel. Remember also that Syria is on board the Arab Summit plan. So Syria wants to have peace, and if Syria wants to have peace, it's because it has acknowledged that Israel is militarily superior to any combination of Arab power, and the only way to contain Israel within its 1967 borders is through peace. Moreover, peace with Syria opens the door to the normalization of relations between Israel and other Arab countries. Peace with Syria weakens Hezbollah. Peace with Syria weakens Hamas. Peace with Syria neutralizes Iran. For Lebanon, peace between Syria and Israel may mean the end of Syrian interference. And for the people of Syria, the return of the Golan means not only the recovery of their sovereignty over their land, but also the inability of the Assad regime to prolong martial law, because martial law has been there. The justification is that there is a state of war with Israel. Well, let's end the state of war. I am the first to recognize, and this is why I said the word ideally, that this is all ideal, because I think this is not going to happen anytime soon. The atmosphere of trust that existed, or that may have existed between Syrian negotiators and their American interlocutors during the 1990s, that relationship of trust does not exist between Washington and Damascus today. A second qualifier, a second caveat, is that Presidents Bush and Prime Minister Olmert are both weak, and Assad is only slightly stronger. And so the three are in a weak position, and I don't think none can deliver what they are required to deliver. So, and here that bridges, that dovetails nicely with Ambassador Miller's thesis earlier, that what we probably need to be working on now are the atmospherics, to set things up, to set an atmosphere up for hopefully the near future, when and if Syrian-Israeli talks resume and Israel returns the Golan to Syria and Syria normalizes its relations with Israel. Thank you.
Thank you. Itamar?
Thank you. Nice to be back at the Wilson Center. First time in the new Middle East program, but I was a visiting scholar here in 1986. It was a wonderful time. I'm delighted to be back here. I will speak mostly about Syria from an Israeli vantage point. I will not say much about the Israeli-Lebanese relationship because after the debacle Israel had in Lebanon in 1982, I think the majority opinion in the country is that it's not our business and not in our capacity to try to shape or to participate in shaping Lebanese national politics. Israeli withdrawal in stages represented that recognition, and for about a decade in the 1990s, we felt that we should solve, quote-unquote, our Lebanese problem through Syria. The collapse of the Israeli-Syrian negotiation in 2000 led to the unilateral Israeli withdrawal from Lebanon in the same year. What is our Lebanese problem? Lebanon, unfortunately, approximates the model of a failed state in the sense that it cannot exercise its sovereignty over its whole territory. It certainly doesn't control the frontier area with Israel. It certainly has to tolerate the existence of a militia of sorts, Hezbollah, that in many respects is more powerful than the state. And of course, when you have that position across one of your borders, you have a problem, which is a problem we have been dealing with since the Lebanese Civil War of 1975, 1976. It is an acute problem for Israel, but I think beyond Israel's ability to solve by itself, and needs to be addressed in a larger regional framework, very much in the spirit of what Dennis Ross described to us earlier. But let me talk about Israel and Syria. And here, again, the year 2000 is a very important turning point. Until 2000, 4 Israeli prime ministers and the Clinton administration believed that the Arab-Israeli peace process should be sequenced. You cannot solve everything in one fell swoop. And they preferred a Syria-first policy, on the assumption that Syria was a state, had a powerful authoritative leader, one difficult to negotiate with, but once you concluded a deal with Hafez al-Assad, he could and will deliver. And so Rabin, then Peres, then Netanyahu, and Ehud Barak, all willing to withdraw from the Golan Heights in order to make a deal with Syria. They all failed. Some of us have pondered and written about why it failed, but it failed. But in 2000, Hafez al-Assad died, was replaced by Bashar al-Assad, who certainly does not fit the bill. And in Israel, Ehud Barak was replaced by Ariel Sharon, who made it very clear that he believed in Palestine first and maybe Palestine only policy. It's certainly antagonistic to the notion of withdrawing from the Golan, but in any event, he felt that any Israeli prime minister could do one big deal at a time, and that the big deal had to be accomplished on the Palestinian track or on the Palestinian front, ended up disengaging unilaterally from Gaza before he was incapacitated. But Syria for him was not an option, and feelers made by Bashar al-Assad in the years of when he felt isolated and weak were rebuffed by Sharon. In the United States, Clinton was replaced by George W. Bush, as we know. The policy has been very different, different emphasis altogether, and over time a great dislike for Bashar al-Assad's Syria, primarily because of Iraq, also because of Lebanon and other issues. So that when Israelis do consult with members of the administration about the prospect of dealing with Syria, the signal they get is negative. It's not a diktat, it's a signal that has to be taken seriously among partners or allies. Recently, in the last few months, there have been several statements by Bashar al-Assad himself, by Foreign Minister Moallem and others, sending a mixed signal, saying on the one hand, we would like to resume the negotiations, we would like to conclude a peace agreement with Israel, but if that doesn't happen, if there is no response to this gambit, the danger of war is there, we will resort to war. So a dual, some extent contradictory message. And the response from Mr. Olmert has been flatly negative. So not interested in negotiating with Syria, and offers a variety of explanations for that. Why? Number one, he's a Sharon disciple, if you wish. He inherited Sharon, he inherited his policies. He was elected on a platform of moving ahead on the Palestinian track, and it was not and is not on his agenda to move ahead on the Syrian track. He is also weak politically. He is preoccupied with his political survival. This is a loaded issue. If you begin a negotiation with Syria, you have to confront also the Golan lobby, which proved to be very powerful in the late years of the previous decade, and as Dennis Ross knows very well, weighed heavily Barak's conduct at Shepardstown. So Olmert doesn't think he needs that too. Now, I think it's an erroneous approach. I think you should not say a flat no to Syrian overtures. You should say yes, but. What is the but? The but is some of the lessons we have to draw from a decade of failed negotiations. There were things we means Americans, Israelis, and Syrians did the wrong way in a decade of negotiations. There are lessons to be learned from it. Let's not call them preconditions, but negotiation, if started, has to be conducted in a different way. What do I mean? For instance, we accepted in the 1990s that we will negotiate with Assad, and Assad will continue to support Hezbollah acting against us in Lebanon. It was a mistake. I think that if we resume negotiations, this will not be or should not be acceptable from an Israeli point of view. The Syrians likewise may put their own conditions for the way the negotiations should be renewed. So no, my advice, don't say no, say yes. But secondly, coordinate, as Israel's Prime Minister, coordinate your policies with the U.S. administration, your ally. And here, of course, you have to take into account the two schools of thought that Dennis mentioned before, but there should be a conversation, there should be a discussion between the Prime Minister of Israel or the government of Israel and the administration about the pros and cons of engaging with Syria. Now, engaging is one of these wonderful terms that don't mean much. So, if we listen to the rhetoric and read the papers in the last few days, we saw Prime Minister Blair talking about partnership with Iran and Syria. We saw about talk to Syria, and we saw engage Syria. The partnership, I think, is far-fetched. Talk to is clear enough, and engage is not at all clear. You can use it in constructive ambiguity. Now, I don't think we are ripe to start negotiations with Syria, but we are ripe for exploratory talks with Syria, confidential exploratory talks. Now, by definition, this, I cannot say will not be advertised, but should not be advertised when it happens. We have a sorry history of leaks. Professor Gioveggiati mentioned earlier the document that leaked out of Shepardstown and did a lot of damage to negotiations, and we remember a few other similar episodes. It's difficult to keep a secret in Israel more than in Syria, but there were successful secret negotiations that preceded breakthroughs in Arab-Israeli relations between Dayan and Tuhami in the Egyptian case that did not leak, many years of secret diplomacy between Israel and Jordan, and of course Oslo, that was kept effectively a secret until the right moment. So what you need to have in order for two countries like Israel and Syria to be able to make a deal are the two ends of the spectrum. You do need public diplomacy, and a lot of it, because without changing the attitude of the constituencies, an agreement between leaderships will not be feasible. But you also need, at the other end of the spectrum, secret diplomacy. The leaderships need to know what the other side has in mind. Yes, of course, Bashar al-Assad and Syria want the Golan back, but how soon, in what fashion, how is it related to the other components of the Syrian agenda? This needs to be explored, and needs to be explored in a confidential fashion. So my recipe for Israeli policy in this regard is say yes, but coordinate with the United States and try to find a way of conducting confidential exploratory talks with Syria in order to find out whether a deal is feasible, and if so, how. Thank you.
Thank you. Hisham.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Hali. Before I address the regional situation, let me just say a few words about Lebanon. Now, during the summer war, every time I was asked to address Lebanon and the war, I tried very hard not to sound like a Cassandra. But every time I did sound in the end like a Cassandra, and I'm afraid that today also I would sound like a Cassandra. I have nothing but gloom and doom to talk about. 3 months after the ceasefire, Lebanon is in the midst of a serious political crisis, potentially a constitutional crisis that is likely, very likely, to lead to further political unraveling and communal violence. In this environment, it's very difficult to talk about realistic options that would involve Lebanon in any kind of revived peace talks. I mean, I'm amazed sometimes when I hear Ehud Olmert inviting Fouad Siniora to meet and to discuss after what the amount of incredible destruction that was visited on Lebanon by the Israelis during the war. Conditions are not ripe. I know in town we used to make fun of the theory of ripeness in the old days, but conditions are not ripe. And while this war changed a lot of things in Lebanon and in the region, it did not change one of the fundamental issues involving Lebanon and peace with Israel. That is, Lebanon cannot and will not sign a peace treaty with Israel if it is seen as separate peace deal. Now, obviously, it was unthinkable when the Syrians controlled Lebanon, but there are powerful voices in Lebanon who are not willing to engage Israel in any kind of meaningful peace talks as long as it is not within a comprehensive framework. Nobody wants to repeat of the May 17th Accord. The Syrians will always be in a position to undermine any kind of such a peace, and many Lebanese, including those who wanted to have some sort of an openness before the summer war, obviously are not in the mood now to talk about peace. At this stage, it would be a great achievement from the Lebanese perspective, and I realize that there are many Lebanese perspectives on this, but it would be, at least from this perspective, it would be a great achievement if Resolution 1701 that stopped the fighting between Israel and Hezbollah is fully implemented. Hezbollah, I would argue, is bent today on toppling the Siniora government. They are interested in calling for new parliamentary elections to set the stage for the election of the president next year, a president that Hezbollah is hoping that will not push for its own disarmament. The tale of Lebanon today is a tale of two countries. The current struggle is between two visions of two futures, two contradictory visions, two contradictory futures of Lebanon. During the days of the Civil War, we used to talk about West Beirut, East Beirut, West Side story, East Side story. Today we're talking about what kind of Lebanon the Lebanese want. Today we have an attempt on the part of Hezbollah, arguably the strongest, most potent, disciplined, political, military force in Lebanon, to shape Lebanon in its own image, a country rooted in a culture of resistance, ثقافة المقاومة, to be in a perpetual state of confrontation with both Israel, the United States, and in broadly speaking with the West. In other words, an attempt to transform Beirut gradually into a Tehran on the Mediterranean. Barring this, Hezbollah will maintain, by force I would argue, its state within a state status. Hamas really is a joke compared to Hezbollah when it comes to discipline, determination, the charisma of its leadership, their capability, and their regional alliances. Really, Hamas is a minor league. On the other side, in Lebanon, we have a loose coalition of forces. Some would like to resurrect the old regime, the ancien regime, the old privileged groups in Lebanon, the elite of Beirut. Others would like to implement the Taif Accords. The few liberals that are still surviving in Lebanon would like to reform the system and let it evolve gradually. Most of these forces would like to maintain Lebanon's traditional Western orientation. Most of these groups would like to disarm Hezbollah, and most of these groups would like to reduce Syria and Iran's influence in Lebanon into manageable levels. Now, just as you find today Turkish scholars asking publicly, wondering whether Turkey now is beginning to lose its long traditional Western orientation, I think it would probably be apropos to ask in Lebanon whether Lebanon, or whether we are in Lebanon today at the beginning of the end of Lebanon's long traditional Western orientation. It is an extremely important one of those political, cultural, historic questions, if you will. Now, Hezbollah obviously is calling for what they call a national unity government, which is really a bid to have a stronger veto than the current veto that they have, so that they will prevent the Lebanese state from implementing fully 1701. That will prevent the Lebanese state from changing to have a serious investigation into the assassination of Hariri, the former Prime Minister of Lebanon, Rafi al-Hariri, and the subsequent assassination attempts that occurred in Lebanon in the last 16, 17, 18 months. Now, 1701 really presented Lebanon with a more or less workable, important resolution that would deal with the immediate problems, but definitely would not resolve the problems between the Israelis and Lebanon, or between Hezbollah and Israel. But definitely it changed the situation on the ground. For the first time, you have the Lebanese army, with all its very well-known weakness, deployed at the Lebanese-Israeli border for the first time in three decades. You had Hezbollah losing some of its presence in the area south of the Litani River. You have 10,000 foreign troops, in addition to 15,000 Lebanese troops. Hezbollah lost somewhat its freedom of movement in the south, although the joke in Beirut is that above ground you have the UNIFIL and the Lebanese army, and underground you still have Hezbollah fighters, and there is some truth into that. Obviously, the command and control, the organization of Hezbollah in South Lebanon is still intact. But what Hezbollah fears at this stage is that the Lebanese government may interpret 1701 in a way that would really make it very difficult for Hezbollah to maintain receiving weapons and arms from Iran via Syria or from the sea. Now that you have a more kind of strong implementation of 1701, you have the German Navy patrolling the Lebanese shores. You have a greater expertise, technical and otherwise, being deployed in the main airport and at the crossing points between Syria and Israel. Obviously, the borders are porous, and some weapons will probably go through, but it's very difficult to put a medium long-range missile on a mule to cross the Lebanese-Syrian border. But Hezbollah obviously is very concerned about 1701 and concerned also about a serious investigation of the Hariri assassination. Not that they are involved in it, although there are rumors in Beirut that Hezbollah may have been involved somehow in some of these acts of violence that occurred in the last 18 months. which ended up in killing a number of people who are very well known for their anti-Hezbollah and anti-Syrian points of view. The Syrians obviously don't want to see a successful international investigation or international tribunal that would investigate Hariri's assassination, given the fact that it is very likely to point to some level of Syrian involvement in it. Now, on a regional level, let me say just briefly, I really don't see any viable peace process that is likely to occur in the next year or two or probably 3 years. The Bush administration did not pursue the peace process aggressively, and if I remember when the Bush administration came into being, they did not want us at the State Department to use the words peace process. The Bush administration has lost a great deal of its credibility as an honest broker after the Hamas elections and after the Lebanese Hezbollah war. And I find it very difficult to see the Bush administration, which is trying to extricate itself from the mess in Iraq, from the quagmire in Iraq, at the same time trying to pursue a comprehensive peace talks, as some people are arguing. What the recent war showed clearly is that there is a crisis of leadership in Israel. There is a crisis of leadership among the Palestinians. There is a crisis of leadership in Syria. One of the ironies is that the only leader who somewhat emerged stronger after the war was Fuad Sinura, and that's one of the ironies of the conflict. The Olmert government, in a funny way, the Arabs are used to strong Israeli leaders, assertive, bold, brutal Israeli leaders, but they are rarely, were faced with pathetic leadership. Not only the Israeli military performance was beyond problematic, the Israelis were flailing politically, and everybody in the Arab world was watching, and beyond the Arab world, particularly in Tehran. So I really don't expect the Olmert government to do anything. The addition of Lieberman was discussed earlier. I don't need to discuss it. The Palestinians are fragmented. Our friend Bashar al-Assad is very weak, notwithstanding the public rhetoric. I doubt that he is ready for prime time. I doubt that Syria as a state today is much, much weaker than it used to be when Hafiz al-Assad was around. Some of the assumptions that you hear about Syria today in Washington are the same assumptions that you heard about Syria when Hafiz al-Assad was around. And they were valid, maybe. Many of them were valid. Today, they are not valid. There is a world of difference between Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad. A world of difference. Bashar al-Assad is a great testimony about the pitfalls of political inheritance, if there is anything like that. Syria is one of the ironies of this. People talk about Iran and Syria. And this is one of the enduring, fascinating marriage of conveniences in the Middle East that occurred in the modern day Middle East. From 1979 until now, this was not a relationship based on love or ideology, but on mutual interest. And in the early days, Hafiz al-Assad was in the driver's seat. In the early days, Iran did need Syria because of its Iran was against the wall fighting Iraq and the rest of the Arab world. And Hafiz al-Assad always kept the Iranians at arm's length, made it very clear that this is a marriage of convenience, nothing beyond that. Now Syria finds itself under the leadership of Bashar al-Assad fully in the political orbit of Iran. One of the ironies of the region now is that Hafiz al-Assad, who had a very healthy, I should say, hatred for organized Islamist political parties, he used them, he always used them, he always exploited them, but he always kept them at arm's length. He would never embrace them. Bashar al-Assad, if anything, is in awe of Hassan Nasrallah. When it comes to a man-o-man, if you will, mano-a-mano, it's Nasrallah who is the charismatic one and the muallim, or the teacher, if you will, and not Bashar al-Assad. And you would never see Hafiz al-Assad embracing Hassan Nasrallah in the heart of Damascus. Never. And one of the ironies of Syria today under Bashar al-Assad is that this state of 18, 20 million people has to depend on a non-state actor named Hezbollah to maintain the little that was left of its regional influence. If Hafiz al-Assad is watching the situation from wherever he is, he'll be turning in his grave. I would argue that Dante would probably put him well below Muhammad. Anyway, so Syria, I don't think is ready for I'm not sure. I think the Syrian regime probably is interested in the main thing that the Syrian regime is interested in, that is to remain in power. The Syrian, I don't even want to call it the regime. It's the Syrian family. Today, it's as they used to say in the old days when Hafez Assad was around. The argument among Syria watchers is that this is essentially a Alawi state. It has a Alawi core, but it has a Sunni veneer. Now the Sunni veneer is gone. And it's a family within a tribe, within a community called the Alawis that is in charge. I mean, the family with its all different branches, the Makhluf branches who are in charge of skimming and milking the country economically, and the Assad family, which is monopolizing the political decision-making process in Iraq. I really don't think Bashar is willing to really enter into serious negotiations with the Israelis, a negotiation that would require him to open up borders, to engage the Israelis publicly. I mean, the Syrian institutions are hollow. And one kind of symbolic example I always give about this, when Farouk Shara, who is a heartbeat away from the presidency of Syria, had a heart attack years ago. He was helicoptered to the American University's hospital in Beirut. Syria did not even have a first-rate hospital. That great country that has two of the most important cities in the Arab world, Aleppo and Damascus, does not even have a decent university. I mean, every institution in Syria is hollow. They are not ready for war, and they are not ready for peace, I would argue. And that's the tragedy of such a great, once great, culture. Iran and Hezbollah and the radicals in the region, I'm not interested now. I think they believe that America's moment in the Middle East is about to be over. And by that I mean Bush's policy of regime change, spreading democracy. The United States now is seen as stuck in Iraq. The Iranians and Hezbollah and others believe that we represent the alternative, and America and its friends in the region are on the defensive. Why should we be forthcoming? If anything, everybody in the Middle East is interpreting the American elections as a repudiation of the Bush administration's policies in the Middle East. That is, whether it's in Iraq or the issue of democracy. These people are not in the mood to be forthcoming. And now I know that the vogue in Washington is engagement, as Itamar said. And we've heard that before. And everybody's waiting for the Bush-Hamilton recommendations as a new panacea, as the silver bullet that is going to resolve all America's problems in the Middle East, all the problems in the Middle East, from Iran to Iraq to Hezbollah to Hamas to the issue of democracy. I'm all for engagement. I really do. And I think the United States should engage, or at least before engaging these parties, I think at a minimum the United States should make it clear publicly and in a serious fashion to the Iranians and to the Syrians and to Hamas, directly or indirectly, that we are not interested in regime change. Engagement is fine, talks are fine, as long as you do them with an open eye, and as long as engagement doesn't mean appeasement. At this stage, I really don't see the Iranians, when they see Bush wounded, when they see Bush being repudiated by the American electorate, when they see the United States bogged down in Iraq, are going to be in a mood to enter into any kind of grand bargain, especially if part of that grand bargain would be for them to relinquish their nuclear program. They are not going to relinquish their nuclear program. And people can engage in all sorts of wishful thinking in Washington and call it analysis, but that's not going to change the situation on the ground. We are dealing with an ascendant Iran. We are dealing with a weaker Syria that is under the Iranian tent, if you will. Hezbollah is not in the mood to be forthcoming. The Israelis are weak, or they are seen as weak, or are seen as flailing. At best, the United States at this stage, and I fully agree with Aaron, I mean, any push now for comprehensive peace talks between the Arabs and the Israelis is going to end up in a disastrous failure. The conditions are not ripe. We all know what are the contours of a peace, you know, on the Palestinians, the return of the Golan. I mean, Lebanon and Israel's problems are very, minor. But the political will is not there, the conditions are not there, the leadership is not there, the vision is not there, the credibility is not there. And at best, what the United States can do at this stage is maybe to try to engage the Syrians and say, look, if you don't mess around in Lebanon, and if you stop messing around in Iraq, and by the way, the Syrian influence in Iraq is minimal. I mean, the real player in Iraq as an outsider is Iran. Iran, as Brzezinski keeps telling us, and is correct, is a serious country. I wouldn't say that about Syria when it comes to Iraq. So Syrian influence in Iraq is limited. It may have been more important by a year or 18 months ago. So what the Syrians can do in Iraq is very limited, but they can undermine the Lebanese government in Lebanon. I think the Americans should engage them and say, look, if you stop meddling in Lebanon, we may improve bilateral relationship. But we're not going to allow you back to Lebanon to exercise the previous role that they used to exercise. Engage the Iranians to see if they can collaborate on Iraq up to a certain level, although recently we were told that Khalilzad apparently failed in his attempt to engage the Iranians in meaningful cooperation on the security situation in Iraq. Engage Hamas directly or indirectly, definitely negotiate with Mahmoud Abbas, but create the environment, and that's the word that was used before, and hope for the best. Thank you. I lost my voice.
You know, it's Hisham. After listening to you, I'm reminded of there used to be an ABC sports commentator named Chris Schenkel, and one time during a broadcast, he got a report from the field reporter who said that one of the players had suffered a broken leg, and he said, "Thanks for the good news." So after listening to you, I say thank you for the good news. But I think it's important that we not engage in wishful thinking, and I think what you're offering is a kind of perspective on what is a kind of a view of the region where we see weakness everywhere, and when you see weakness everywhere, that's hardly auspicious for transforming the region. But I want to pick up on at least one of your themes and ask Professor Georgiades, let's take the point that Hisham raises. It says this regime in Syria is really weak. And if it is really weak, and the U.S. were to engage it, what could emerge from such an engagement? And do you accept his assessment of the Syrian regime?
I accept Hisham's assessment of the Syrian regime fully, totally. Where I part company with him is that this very weakness might be a source of danger. And this dovetails with what Ambassador Rabinovich said earlier about Olmert's no when there were Syrian entreaties early on to make peace. This reminds me very much of Sadat in 1971. He said this is going to be the year of decision, and nobody took him seriously, and 2 years later there was war. The Syrian regime is weak. Bashar al-Assad is weak. And this we can state while we see things from above and very far from the Middle East. But this is not necessarily the perception that Assad has of himself or of his regime or even of his army. He was very encouraged by the results of the Hezbollah-Israel confrontation. He is very encouraged by the recent elections in the United States. He is very encouraged by increasing voices from the EU to say to the administration, the Bush administration, engage with Syria. So he has, I believe, an illusion of strength that Hisham is telling us, and I agree with him, is not there. And that is the source of danger. If Assad is as weak as I think and Hisham thinks he is, and he comes to absorb it in the near future, and nobody pays attention to him, well, he might resort to war. And so when I say engage the Syrians, it is, the Middle East is in a pitiful situation today, but it could, believe it or not, ladies and gentlemen, it could get worse.
All right, so part of what you're saying is that, in a sense, he could misread the situation and he could miscalculate as a result. I want to ask you one more question before I turn to Itamar. I can say it from my own perspective. There's no question that when we were negotiating in the past, one of the things that subverted the process was Hezbollah and Hamas. And there's no doubt that if you were going to try to persuade this administration that they should engage the Syrians and look at a resumption of a Syrian-Israeli peace process, the position of the administration would be and here I would be supportive of the administration, that if in fact Syria doesn't stop support for Hezbollah and Hamas, then you're entering into a process where you're investing in a process that can be subverted at a time of choosing by Hezbollah or Hamas. Now, if that's the case, is Assad capable of taking the steps towards Hezbollah and Hamas that you need to sustain a peace process from the outset, or at least from some stage within that process? Or, as I listen to you, is he only capable of doing it after he's reached an agreement?
Hafez al-Assad was a very Machiavellian person, and he was a student of diplomacy but with teeth. If you are going to negotiate with Israel without any teeth, you're not going to get much out of them. But if you have some power to deter or to scare or to whatever, then you might get somewhere with the Israelis. I think that Bashar would follow along the same lines. To ask Bashar to drop Hamas and Hezbollah and then go to the table of negotiations with Israel without guaranteeing what the end is going to be, I don't think that will fly.
Okay. So let's take that one up, and let me turn that over to Itamar, since I now feel like I'm back at my mediator's role. What you've heard from Professor Georgiades is this notion that Syria might be prepared to do something towards Hezbollah and Hamas, but not as a preview to a negotiation, and probably not even in the course of the negotiation, because you have to have your leverage for the negotiation to work. Although what I heard at the very end was also, unless he knew where the outcome was going to be. Is there a way to square that circle? Is there a way? You were talking about confidential, what would amount to secret negotiations. The value of such secret negotiations is that Israel wouldn't have to explain them publicly. Olmert wouldn't be exposed publicly in advance of having something to show for it. Could you engage in such a negotiation knowing that Bashar Assad comes to them feeling that he has to have this kind of leverage to succeed in the negotiations? Could you have a quiet negotiation where Israel could begin a process, and to take what you're saying, look, this process can't lead anywhere unless you do something about these groups, and ultimately we're going to have to be able to show something to our public. How could such a private negotiation proceed?
Okay. Well, this takes us to dangerous grounds of deja vu and nostalgia. I mean, just to mention that there was an Ambassador Georgiades in the Syrian delegation that we began negotiating with, and that much of what I will address now actually took place in Dennis Ross's living room. Because, the negotiation began in a very formal way on the 6th floor of the State Department building with two delegations with cassette recorders on the desks, and there was no way to conduct a negotiation. We had to break away from that mold, and eventually, after much tribulation, Assad agreed to Ambassador Moallem and myself, meeting always in the presence of an American, and normally it was Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk, always but once in Dennis Ross's living room, and I think we spent hundreds of hours making significant progress on the issues, and that had not been wasted, because when negotiations are resumed at some point, it's been said in the previous panel, we know what peace would look like between Israelis and Palestinians and Israelis and Syrians, and that is because in both cases the shape of the contours of a settlement have already been drawn. Now, when we discussed the very same issue about what will Syria do vis-a-vis Hezbollah terrorism in the event that we sign peace. By the way, it's been agreed that, of course, depending on Israel and Syria finalizing their own agreement, Syria would agree to Lebanon signing a peace agreement, a full-fledged peace agreement with Israel. And the question then came up, well, what about groups like Hezbollah? And then the answer, the most explicit Ambassador Moallem would be, was, well, you wouldn't imagine that Syria would make peace with Israel only to let other people try to undermine it. So implicitly, because the statement was there, but it was never explicit or binding. Now, there was also the question of what does Syria get for all of this, and there was the famous deposit made originally by Rabin and then reiterated by his successors in various ways. But this was a stumbling block that was never fully overcome because Hafez al-Assad, being Hafez al-Assad, wanted to be 100% sure that he had not just a deposit or a pledge, he wanted a commitment, and hopefully a written commitment, which no Israeli Prime Minister wanted to give, suspecting, among other things, that Assad would then walk away from the negotiation, having the formal commitment to withdraw from the Golan Heights without giving the peace. And to the final collapse of the peace process in the Clinton-Assad meeting in Geneva, that had not been overcome. So when if we get to that exploratory phase that I was speaking about earlier, we'll have to find ways of dealing in an imaginative way that draws on the lessons of the failures of the past, with the two parts of this equation. I mean, the Syrians would need to know that if peace is made, they will get what they want, and the Israelis and the Americans would need to know that, number one, I mean, Syria will indeed bail out of that marriage of convenience. If it is a marriage of convenience, I suspect that it's more than a marriage of convenience. It's now a subservient or subordinate relationship with Iran. But that's the merit of exploring. Either they can deliver that or they cannot. And secondly, it will have to commit explicitly not to let Khaled al-Mashal sit in Damascus and undermine Israeli-Palestinian talks, and not to let Hezbollah undermine Lebanon and Lebanese-Israeli relations.
Sounds to me like we'd be talking about a mutual deposit system, and we would probably be talking about, if we were listening to Aaron in the first panel, maybe a fourth roadmap, where you would identify within that fourth roadmap what each side would be prepared to do, and it would have to be sufficiently concrete as it relates to Hezbollah and Hamas to be convincing, not only to the Israelis but also to the United States. And what Israel would be doing would be spelling out what it was prepared to do in terms of the border. The truth is, when we were in Geneva, we put on the table a map that had full withdrawal from the Golan Heights. The map had nothing to do with being on the Golan Heights. It had to do with where the border was as it related to the northeast corner of the lake. And it was a difference of, the actual map we put on the table was 400 meters off the lake, so it was not connected to the Golan Heights, but only to the water. But I'm going to go on, because Hisham, I want to get at something that you were saying. You suggested, yeah, there should be engagement between the United States and Syria, more vis-a-vis Iraq, but there should be something as it related to Lebanon. One of the interesting things I know from my own conversations with the Bush administration, whenever I've raised different ways one might deal with Syria, and they've been so far able to restrain their enthusiasm for that approach, one of the points they always raise is, well, Syria wants Lebanon, and so that's the reason we don't want to engage with Syria. Now, as I listen to you, you, on the one hand, seem to think that, yeah, they do, but maybe if you talk to them, there's a way to create some limits. On the other hand, given the weakness of Syria as you see it, what would an engagement do right now in that regard? And number one, is there a danger, from your perspective, that the Syrians might misread the U.S. readiness to engage right now? Would they see it as a sign of weakness here? Because that seems to be the implication from the concluding set of comments you made.
Definitely, the Syrian reading and the Iranian reading is that the United States now is in a much weaker position than it used to be 3 years ago, obviously. And when I talk about conditional engagement with the Syrians, the Americans and the Syrians, obviously I'd like the Americans to engage the Syrians to keep them off Lebanon. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. The United States, excuse me, the United States can engage Syria and focus the engagement on some bilateral issues. I mean, we don't have an ambassador in Damascus. Maybe a return of the ambassador would be put on the table in return for Syria not to meddle in Lebanon. The Americans can engage the Syrians on Iraq up to a certain point, although I don't have any illusions about Syria's importance in Iraq. Make it clear to the Syrians. Look, I mean, the Syrians would respect. Look, Assad liked to deal with Rabin because he knew where he stood with Rabin. Assad and Hussein, everybody else did not like to deal with Peres because they didn't know where Peres stood. Peres was wishy-washy on a lot of issues. And if Bush is very clear with Bashar in particular that there are certain limits, there are certain red lines, and we may be engaging here, but don't have any illusions too, you know, that would be one way of engaging the Syrians at this stage. I really don't have much illusions on this. But at the same time, because everybody's talking about engagement, and let's talk to the Syrians, if something positive could come out of it, whether on the level of bilateral relations or on the level of cooperation on Iraq, I mean, logically and theoretically, one could argue that it's not in Syria's interest for the whole situation in Iraq to unravel, because it will spill over. And sectarianism in Iraq, I mean, one reason we have this now polarization, the demarcation line in the region is between the Sunnis and the Shia. Everywhere we have Sunnis and Shia, whether it's Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Kuwait, Syria in the case of the Alawis, and Lebanon. And during the war, I kept saying, you know, the minute the guns fall silent, the recrimination in Lebanon will be basically between the Shia and the Sunni. It's not only the old Muslim-Christian demarcation line, it's the Shia-Sunni demarcation line. And if you have a thoughtful leadership in Syria, they should be extremely careful about the Sunni sentiment in Syria. I mean, I'm not sure to what extent the Syrian government today controls the Qamishli area and the Kurdish areas. I mean, it's a very tenuous situation, and I'm not sure Assad is fully aware of this. So the United States can talk to Assad and say, look, you know, you are weak. We know that you are weak, and stop meddling in Lebanon. Let's see what we can do in terms of bilateral relationship, and also say, look, if you cooperate, we will keep in mind, and we would at a later stage, and we do recognize that you have strategic interest in Lebanon. We do recognize that you want the Golan back. And we do recognize that the Syrian track should be revived at one stage. I mean, but you start by assuring them that we are not interested in regime change. I mean, if you put it that way, then engagement may make sense from my perspective.
Let me ask you, all right, in a sense what you're saying is you engage that way, you try to draw some limits, but you also make it clear that there's a kind of pathway towards a very different relationship with the United States. And
a roadmap, if you wish.
Well, a fifth roadmap.
Yeah.
All right. So what about the flip side of that? What if those discussions didn't lead anywhere? Would there have to be a consequence?
If they meddle in Lebanon, yes. Why shouldn't they? Of course. Look, I mean, I think in the hearts of many Syrians, Lebanon is a geographic mistake. Just as it is in the heart of many Iraqis. And you know, let's be blunt about this. Kuwait was a geographic mistake. And it's very difficult for many in the Syrian political culture I mean, one of the reasons for traditional Syrian frustration in the region is that the Syrians always felt, and I'm talking about the last 50 years, I'm not talking about the Ba'ath only, I'm talking about the political culture of Syria. They've always felt that they are living in a truncated state. That Lebanon should not have been independent, that, you know, maybe northern Palestine is part of it, that Jordan is a joke. And you know, and I'm not talking about the greater Syria in the traditional sense, but essentially, this is how Assad operated, by the way. I mean, yeah, it's true that he was driven by raison d'etat, but he always kept his eye on that whole region, the geographic region. So maybe in the heart of hearts of people like Bashar and Farouk Shara, Lebanon is a geographic mistake. Fine, well, let them think what they want to think, as long as they live by the international rules.
A footnote to this: I know that the Biden initiative is being discussed, And there are some merits to it, but the reason it won't fly is what Sham Milham called geographic mistake, is the debate about the partition, the British-French partition of the Middle East, and the creation of the state system after World War I. And other than Egypt, everybody is quote-unquote artificial. The geographic name that doesn't necessarily fit ethnic and other realities. And the sense is that once you pull the first stone out of that wall, the whole wall may collapse. And therefore, when Biden speaks about federal Iraq with 3 entities, it is perceived in the Arab world as, oh, here they are again. I mean, not the French and the British, but the Americans trying to repartition the Arab world. So it's much more than sort of a geographic mistake or a cruel joke, as you said. It's the whole debate that's still not finished a century later, almost a century later, about the rearrangements of the Middle East in the aftermath of World War I.
That may be the case. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Georgiades in a second. I would bet, however, that if we look 10 years from now or even 15 years from now in Iraq, what we're going to see is a central government with limited powers, provinces with very extensive autonomy, some formula for how they share the revenues. And the question is, will you get there through 10 or 15 more years of terrible civil war with every neighbor treating Iraq the way they used to treat Lebanon, meaning they're competing with their friends, or do you try to manage a transition? Now, it may not be, the question is who's going to manage that transition? Professor Georgiades. Then we will turn it over to the audience, even though it's not easy for me to do that.
Two things briefly I'd like to say. On the first point with Ambassador Rabinovich, when Walid Muallim implicitly said, well, we're going to have peace with you, we're not going to unleash Hezbollah, there was a point in time during the peace process, during the Syria-Israel talks, where things were going surprisingly particularly well, and Abdul Halim Khaddam, at the time vice president, called over to his office the heads of different Palestinian organizations to encourage them very strongly to go become gentlemen farmers, that they had to look for other jobs because armed resistance is going to be over. On the question of Lebanon being, in the minds of Syrians, a geographic mistake, it's a wonderful geographic mistake. It's a very beautiful country, but you know, things in Syria are dynamic. Syrians today do not think as they did 30 years ago. There is a young guard that is growing. Lebanon, in the minds of many, probably would be an extension of Syria, but in the minds of most is no longer that. Patrick Seal the other day had an interview with Farouk Shara in which Farouk Shara saw no problem in having a Syrian embassy in Beirut. But what the Syrians do want to emphasize is that the relationship between Syrians and Lebanese is quite unique. The Syrians are not foreigners to Lebanon the way Israelis are. This is not to say that all Syrians want to still envision and incorporating Lebanon into their backyard.
All right, I'm going to turn over to the audience, although I can't resist one final brief comment. Historically, actually, what Muallim said at one point on those who would challenge a peace agreement between Syria and Israel would be threatening Syria's national interests, and everyone understood very clearly how the Syrians dealt with those who threatened their national interest. I didn't take that for being all that subtle, but in any case, let me turn it over to the audience. Yes, you have pride of place since this is your show.
If I look from an Iranian point of view, why should I encourage an engagement between Syria and the United States? So supposedly Syria decides to go this road. What are the consequences for Syria of alienating Iran? And would Iran be up to all sorts of mischief in Syria, like in Iraq?
I'm going to assume that you were looking at Hisham, but I'm going to let all the panelists who would like to respond to that, they can respond to that.
If Hafiz al-Assad was in charge of Syria today, and if he's in good health, he could do that. I mean, if Hafiz al-Assad sees what is the prize at the end, that is reclaiming the Golan and recognition by the Israelis and the Americans of his influence in the region, including Lebanon, he would do that. He would do that. There was a time when we used to talk about Hezbollah and say there are the purists in Hezbollah who look at Iran for guidance and spiritual whatever, and the ideological connection, and there are the pragmatists who believe that geography is sometimes more important than ideology, which means Syria can block Hezbollah's supply lines to Iran, and I mean you may have your own interpretation of history, but you cannot have your own interpretation of geography. And geography has its own cruelty, if you will. Theoretically, Syria can and should, in my mind, pursue its own interest, and Syria has legitimate interest in the Levant, and I think the Israelis would recognize that. And I fully agree with Murhaf. I mean, the Lebanese and the Syrians, I mean, when you look at the intermarriage and the cultural relationship and the historic relationship, and I mean, Damascus is just 15 kilometers away from the Lebanese borders. Obviously, we have no problem in having a special relationship with the Syrians. It's a question of whether, we want to be controlled. You may say whatever you want to say about the state system in the Middle East, but it's a reality. Most borders in the region are lines in the sands. And you know what our friends in Egypt, they have this famous joke, we are the only state in the region, and the rest of the Arabs are a bunch of tribes with flags. I mean, you look at Iran, a country with great identity, great history, Turkey, Egypt, Morocco. The rest are still searching for. I mean, Iraq is still a process. Iraq is still a nation in process. And only recently, until Saddam blew it up 20 years ago with his war around, you began to see an Iraqi identity, really. It is a hodgepodge, but it is now, So to go back to your question, yeah, Syria can and should. Theoretically, if it makes the decision if it is convinced that it can reclaim the Golan Heights, and assuming that the leadership would like to, engage Israel in serious negotiations, and it is in a position to deliver on the requirements of peace, because there will be a requirement of peace, and there will be those in Syria who will be opposed to this kind of peace. They can do it, but I mean, unless they see the end result, unless they see what is the prize, and at this stage, even if this current leadership see it, I'm not sure they have the capability to engage in such a bargain with Israel.
To go back to the larger picture, let's say the Baker-Hamilton report, there are three options. One is that one talks about talk to Iran and Syria. So if that happens, there should be no tension between Iran and Syria. There should be one package. Another option is that talk to neither. In that case, problem doesn't arise. The interesting option is say, well, there's no point in talking to Iran. They will not give up their nuclear option, and so forth and so forth. In that case, let us try to snatch Syria from the Iranian orbit. This could be the spectacular diplomatic coup, let's say comparable to Kissinger snatching Egypt out of the Soviet orbit. And that would be a very intriguing option from a U.S. Policy point of view. And if that materializes and becomes an option, then the veracity of some of our assumptions will have to be tested. I mean, does Syria have the power, the ability to dissociate itself from Iran? Is it really just a marriage of convenience that the Syrians can walk out of? We don't know the answers, but it may very well be the one realistic option, and the truth of the matter may then surface.
Very briefly, I think Syria is snatchable. A very recent interview with Assad after Ahmadinejad had one more time threatened Israel with extinction and all this. Assad was asked about Ahmadinejad's comment, and he said, well, we want to make peace with Israel, not war. And that suggests perhaps a modicum of autonomy in that Assad is looking first and foremost for Syrian interests rather than the interests of this alliance?
I would, since you asked me as well, I would make 2 points. Point number one would be apropos what Muraf just said. You know, when you have this nexus of Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas, all of whom reject Israel's right to exist, and Iran Ahmadinejad seems to try to compete on a daily basis with how he can say something even more outrageous, because he'll say not that they shouldn't exist, but that in fact they won't. And now his most recent comment, I think the day before yesterday, was they will disappear soon. Israel will disappear soon. Well, would be rather interesting for Syria and Israel then to have a public negotiation, even though we're talking about private, because it sends a rather interesting message. If Iran is on such a roll, then how is it that Syria would be prepared to talk openly to the Israelis? If Hezbollah and Hamas reject Israel's right to exist and Syria opts out, what does that do to that whole imagery of rejection? So I think when you look at it, you should look at it through that lens, number one. Number two, the point that Itamar was making, if it's snatchable, one has to think about how you create a context. Now, the Syrians obviously are going to want something. I would also say they also have to see what they lose, because they won't simply be induced. They'll also have to see what they lose, because then they have to weigh. They will look at what Iran could do to them. So when they're looking at it, they're going to say, all right, what do we gain? And they're also say, what do we lose? And it's not only what we do, it's also what you have everybody else doing. I would say that Saudi attitudes towards Syria today look rather different to me than they were in the past, including with this king, who in the past always had a kind of certain feeling that you always had to do something with Syria. I think if you look at where he's coming from these days, he tends to see everything through an Iranian lens. And that lens is a pretty hostile one in his eyes. And if he sees Syria supporting that, then his posture towards Syria might be very different than in the past. But if he also sees they're snatchable, that also has implications in terms of what they could do. So I think when you look at this issue, we've been trying to say, look at it in terms of a regional context. I would say, look at it through not just us and Iraq, look at it in terms of where the Gulf states, and particularly the Saudis, might be. All right, all the way in the back. Yes.
We've heard very little today about the rise of Shiism. It seems to me, as you look back, it's been 1,000 years and more since we've faced this kind of an insurgent Shia. I'd like to get some sense of what the panel thinks, where that's going, and how amenable they are to any of the kind of suggestions that you're making.
Who would like to, anybody want to volunteer to deal with that?
Hisham is raising his hand.
No, well,
You've
look,
been volunteered.
We have been seeing a Shia awakening, or Shia assertiveness, if you will. It began in Lebanon in the late 1960s. I used to refer to the Shia of Lebanon, who represent the plurality of Lebanese, as the invisible community. This was a community that was marginalized by the modern-day Lebanese system. A system that was dominated by the Maronites and an alliance of the Maronites and the urban Sunnis of Beirut and Tripoli and Sidon. And the Shia were in the background. And they were like the characters in Albert Camus' novel. You know, if you remember the Albert Camus novels about Algeria, you have the French and they are the protagonists, and the Algerians in the background. You rarely know about them, but they are there. Today we have a different situation. That assertiveness, we are seeing it now in Iraq. The Shia have been marginalized for the 80+ years of modern-day Iraq, and they were suppressed in the Gulf states. And even recently, the ambassador of Saudi Arabia in Washington, Prince Turki, admitted publicly that historically the Shia of Saudi Arabia were marginalized, and now the country of Saudi Arabia even recognizes this. So that assertiveness is long overdue. The Shia of Lebanon and Iraq should have their place under the sun. They should have the representation that they deserve. They should get the kind of economic, educational development in their areas that they deserve, and they were denied in the past. So that's all fine and dandy. The problem is also we see this assertiveness at a time when Iran also is asserting its influence as a regional power. Now, I always argued that even when Iran was ruled, and I don't care who is the ruler of Iran, whether he's wearing a turban or a crown or a pinstripe suit, Iran will always act, because it is a great state with a great sense of identity. Iran will always act, it will always be driven by raison d'etat, whether it's given imperial justification the way the Shah used to do it, or Islamist under Khomeini. It is this coincidence, the emergence of Iran as a state, using its relationship, if you will, that sense of Shia solidarity that exists in the region, which crosses, which sometimes transcends cultural differences. That nexus is disturbing. The rise of Iran as a regional power with the assertiveness of the Shia communities in various parts of the Arab world. This assertiveness is correct. This awakening is long overdue. What is disturbing is that nexus with Iran, from my perspective. And it brings with it, as I said earlier, this likelihood of tension, communal tension between the Sunnis and the Shia. And that to me is the problem. It's not the assertiveness of the Shia communities in the Arab world in and of itself. It's that nexus with Iran. If you deal with the Iranian state and limit Iran's influence with these communities, then you have a different ball game. I mean, I used to think that the Shatt al-Arab between Iran and Iraq is not only a geographical boundary, it's a cultural boundary. And it is true up to a certain point, but there is also this sense of solidarity. I mean, if you take Ahmed Chalabi, the infamous Ahmed Chalabi, his wife is Lebanese, from a prominent Shia Lebanese family. There is that intermarriage, there is that connection in business, there is that migration, if you will. The most important jurist in Iran today is a Shia of Iraqi extraction. Just as Sistani is from Sistan in Iran. You have Saddam, when he took over, he dumped hundreds of thousands of Iraqi Shia, just because they were of Iranian origin, dumped them across the border. They stayed in Iran. Iran welcomed them. Now they're back. 100,000 people were pushed to Iran after 1991 when we asked them to rise up against the regime, and we left them being killed, slaughtered by the thousands by Saddam. They went to Iran. Now they are coming back. In the 16th century, it was a bunch of ulama, Shia ulama from Lebanon, from Jabal Amil, who went to Iran and turned Iran, which at that time a mostly Sunni state, into a Shia state. So that connection exists, and it's that nexus now between the assertive Iranian state and the assertive communities, Shia communities in the Arab world, that is worrisome to a lot of people.
What I'm going to do, because
Long history of the Shia in few words.
We don't have a lot of time left, so what I'd like to do, so we have a chance to take a few more questions. Let me take 3 questions, and then we'll have the panel respond it. So to prove how fair-minded I am, I'm going to do left, center, and then right. Okay, all the way over there? My left.
Aram Nergizian, a graduate student at the Elliott School. Forgive me for chaining some of these questions, but I have a question for each of the panelists.
Well, I said I would take 3 questions, not from one person. So, you know,
wishful thinking.
We'll take one from you so that we have others have a chance to ask a question.
In that case, I'll direct the most poignant question to Ambassador Rabinovich. Did Israel include the possible strengthening of Hezbollah and the Lebanese polity in the event of a failure on the part of the IDF in its decision-making process? And what can it do now in the wake of that? Thank you.
Okay. And we'll take all the way in the back.
Rafi Danziger from APAC. And my question is as follows. If you look at what King Abdullah of Jordan called the Shiite crescent and what Ehud Barak called the Shiite banana, there is one missing link, and that is Syria, which is, of course, Sunni majority and controlled by the Alawis. But I've seen some troubling reports in the press that there's a process of Shiization of Syria. We have preachers coming from Iran into Syria. We have mosques being built by the Shiites. The process seems to be quite disturbing, and I would like to hear perhaps from Mokhaf or Hisham whether there's any reality to that process.
Okay, and yes, right here.
Hi, Steve Senna, just an American citizen.
That counts.
Thank you. I have a question
Did
and
you
also
vote?
just a comment on the snatchable aspect, which actually relates to the past comment there. Is when you talk about that Syria is snatchable, does that include the possibility that they're already working on preempting that, which means those supply lines that were going to Hezbollah and Lebanon are now being or have been being cut short, and there could be things stationed in Syria now waiting for that snatchable moment to happen, or at least to confront it with this so-called veto power that keeps emerging. I keep hearing. The question I have is related to this. The other theme that I keep hearing is this: there's a logjam. Everything's stuck. The whole process. There's a leadership vacuum here, there, everywhere, except Tony Blair, who's leaving leadership. So I'm wondering, given that logjam, given this stuck situation, who benefits from that? Meaning with the time element, the time dimension. I mean, this conflict, this region, it's just time immortal. This has been going on. So right now, at this point in time, if you could just speak to who benefits from having more time. I see Israel has.
All right, let's let the panel respond. Okay.
Thank you.
The question was addressed to me. A little bit of perspective. When Ehud Barak withdrew from Lebanon unilaterally in 2000, the assumption was that Israel will have to build normal deterrence, not try to protect northern Israel from inside Lebanon, but withdraw to the international line authorized by or legitimized by the United Nations, and that should attacks come from across that line, Israel will have to deter, as the way states deter attacks on their sovereign territory. This was immediately challenged by the first abduction of killing and abduction of Israeli soldiers in October. Barak chose not to respond. He, at the time, the outbreak of the Intifada, a collision with the Israeli Arab minority, didn't need a third front, and chose not to respond. Sharon, when he replaced him, also chose not to respond to the occasional Hezbollah provocation. And when Olmert made the decision on July 14 to go to war, he decided that enough was enough, and that this was not only a way to restore credibility and build his own position as a leader, but an opportunity, as it were, to give Hezbollah a very serious bloody nose, and maybe even send a larger message to Syria and Iran, stood beyond Hezbollah. And when he did that, he truly believed, as his chief of staff told him, that this could be done in 4 or 5 days and done from the air. 4 or 5 days later, when he realized that this could not be done from the air, he had to contemplate the price of sending 3 divisions on the ground to try to accomplish the same. And to use Hisham Milcham's term, the government flailed politically, realizing that if it wanted a clear-cut outcome or victory, it had to make that investment, but it wasn't quite sure that it was willing to make that investment, and the result was very, very mediocre. So what you are describing is an unintended consequence, not a premeditated one.
Okay. First, Giuliani, why don't you respond to the question of the Shiites? Yes.
And I have heard these reports, and I have spoken on the phone with Syrians that say, yes, there are Shia preachers, and yes, that there is a process now of becoming Shiite, and there is an A and a B to this. There are many folks who were whose political consciousness was awakened and whose passions were fired up with the Hezbollah-Israeli confrontation in the summer, and they were very proud of Hassan Nasrallah and of Hezbollah. B, some preachers are offering money. Yes, exactly. And I contacted a friend and I asked him if he was converting to Shiism, and he said, why would he? And I told him they're offering $10,000, and he said, well, where do I sign? The B part I do not take very seriously in these conversions because it is not very serious. And in the end, I do not believe the numbers to be big at all. It is mostly an area centered around Sitti Zainab outside of Damascus, the tomb of the daughter of the Prophet. And really we are talking about very, very small numbers. So I would not view it as a factor in anything.
Hisham, who does time serve?
Well, it doesn't serve us, and by us I mean the few Democrats with a small d in the Arab world, or the liberals in the Arab world. I know we are maybe an extinct group of people. It serves the radicals at this stage. I don't believe that the so-called Islamic wave has ebbed, and I see more confrontation. I see more violence, whether in Iraq or in Lebanon or in the Arab-Israeli arena. I see weak leadership throughout the region. I see people posing these kind of historical questions, like the Lebanese and the Turks. You know, are we at the cusp of a major shift, cultural and historic, in the region, in the orientation of whole societies? I mean, you know, luckily I was not trained as a journalist, but as someone who studied European philosophy, and I'm a history buff, and I like to watch these things in kind of historical perspective. And what I see in the immediate future doesn't really encourage me at all. I think we're going to go through a period of convulsion and violence, uncertainty, in which the old states, the authoritative states, will become more violent and more assertive and more close to any kind of opening. And you see that in a number of states right now, or stopped the reluctant move to open up. And you see, on the other hand, the Islamists becoming more and more assertive and more aggressive and bolder in their movements and their challenge to the status quo, as well as to the United States. So we're going through a rough ride in the region, and I think when the history of this period is written, the American adventure in Iraq will be seen as catastrophic, and Iraq will haunt us as a society in this country for decades to come. This is worse than Vietnam in that sense, and I think there's very little appreciation in the administration for what kind of a historical mess we got involved in Iraq now. And we will be talking about the American catastrophic engagement in Iraq the way the Brits talked about their own catastrophic engagement in Iraq for a long time to come. So again, I told you I don't like to sound like a Cassandra, but I don't see any other outcome.
I would just wrap it up by also commenting on that by saying that time is serving the Islamicists, and you better begin to find ways to empower the non-Islamicists if you want to see a region that is more hopeful and isn't characterized by a whole lot more pain and suffering. I want to thank the panelists. I think all of them gave really superb presentations and also, I think, very candid, thoughtful answers to the questions. Thank you. December. December. I'll be out there, I think, on